Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I decided to share this story because it made me reconsider simple choices like accepting work shifts during unusual hours. My friend, let's call him Tommy to protect his identity, spent some time working at a 24-hour convenience store in Portland, Oregon. These stores operate around the clock, offering basic and practical items to customers at any hour. A few weeks ago, while I was job hunting and exploring possibilities, I decided to ask Tommy about his experience working there, since I needed something that would fit my schedule so I could continue my studies. He mentioned it was indeed a good option in that regard, as long as it was at a quiet location. Tommy worked at a store near Portland State University, specifically on Southwest Broadway Avenue. He used to say the environment at that particular branch was very good. This was shortly after the pandemic restrictions had eased, so foot traffic was still reduced, almost no lines and customers appearing sporadically. Besides, it was a safe area, with no robbery incidents reported in the previous 2 years. During a conversation at my apartment, I mentioned I was interested in the overnight shift because it would fit perfectly into my routine. At that moment, Tommy became serious, took a deep breath, and after a pause, shared something that seemed to deeply trouble him. He explained that after several months on the job, the night shift employee suddenly quit without prior notice. The manager, left with no other option, asked Tommy to take over this shift. Although reluctant at first, he worked that shift for about a month, and to his surprise, the experience was initially peaceful. There was less customer traffic, which made the work much lighter, and the only occasional challenge was dealing with suppliers. Tommy even started to enjoy the shift, especially because of the night differential pay. Neither of us are impressionable people or easily frightened, and paranormal topics have never particularly disturbed us. However, Tommy said that on one specific night, something out of the ordinary happened. It was around 4 a.m, and he was sitting distracted on his phone, enjoying the calm of his shift. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise, as if someone had slammed their hand on the counter right in front of him. The sound made his heart race. As he looked up, he was petrified to see a thin, almost skeletal hand emerging from dark, dirty rags that exuded a terrible smell of decay. He could barely breathe as he noticed that behind those tatters was something resembling a human figure. Despite the intense light in the store, he couldn't see eyes in that thing's face, only deep, black holes in an empty countenance that simply stared at him. Tommy, finally regaining movement, fell backward awkwardly, knocking over cigarettes and other items that were organized behind him. Some products scattered across the floor, but he didn't take his eyes off whatever was standing before him. The only thing on his mind was trying to understand how something so strange had entered the store without him. Hearing the sound of the small bell attached to the door. All of this happened in a matter of seconds. What had been, until then, an expressionless face began to change slowly. The figure's mouth, which was previously just open, began to form a smile, but not an ordinary smile. It widened abnormally, almost extending from one ear to the other, something that seemed impossible for any human being. Desperate, Tommy tried to reach for his phone to call the police. Meanwhile, that thing began to move toward the entrance of the counter, but the movement was bizarre. It didn't seem to be walking, but rather sliding or floating, never taking its eyes off him. With trembling hands, Tommy dialed the number on his cell phone as quickly as he could. However, when he briefly looked away at the phone screen and raised his eyes again, he realized that the thing had vanished. There was absolutely nothing in front of him. It was then that the sound of the doorbell echoed through the environment, indicating that someone had just entered. He quickly stood up, looking for something on the counter to defend himself with. But what he saw were two college students who had just arrived. The young men, noticing Tommy pale and visibly disturbed, instinctively backed away, perhaps thinking a robbery was in progress. But with what little strength he had, Tommy asked for help. They called another friend who was waiting in the car, and the three entered the store. Tommy tried to explain, still not believing that something or someone had appeared there without him noticing. Perhaps it was a homeless person trying to scare him, the young men suggested. They decided to call the police. When the patrol arrived, they searched the place and the surroundings, but found nothing unusual. Tommy, meanwhile, called the manager, begging him to come to the store. The manager, however, upon hearing that it wasn't a robbery or vandalism, didn't give it much importance and only showed up at 6 in the morning. During the time he waited, Tommy decided to completely lock the store, feeling a little safer as he saw the first rays of sunlight appearing on the horizon. When the manager finally arrived, they reviewed the security camera footage. There were two cameras, one pointed at the parking lot and another focused on the counter. In the video, Tommy could be seen checking his phone until he suddenly seemed to react to something. He raised his face, fell backward, and knocked over products, but there was nothing else. Nothing appeared in the video. No sign of any figure or presence beside him. It was also possible to see the young men entering the store and interacting with Tommy. But the manager noted that everything seemed calm, except for Tommy's uncontrolled reactions. He tried to calm Tommy down, offered him something to eat, and eventually drove him home. Tommy, however, said that he spent the rest of the day unable to rest or sleep. He needed to share what he had witnessed with someone and get some explanation, even though nothing seemed to make sense at that moment. Tommy was shaken the entire day. Before his next shift, the manager called to say he could rest and stay home if needed. The next day, upon returning to the store, Tommy talked with the manager, who ended up confessing something disturbing. The previous night shift employee had gone through a similar experience, which led him to quit the job without explanation. The manager also said he would completely understand if Tommy wanted to change to a different branch or even resign. Additionally, he mentioned there had been other inexplicable occurrences at that location that seemed to escape everyone's understanding. Tommy, without thinking much, decided at that moment to end his relationship with the job. He thanked the manager, left the store, and never accepted a night shift anywhere again. To this day, he seeks some kind of explanation for what he witnessed that night. As for me, after hearing all this, I completely gave up on the idea of working in that place. The thought that something could be lurking in the shadows of a seemingly ordinary convenience store during those quiet, early morning hours was enough to send shivers down my spine. I've since found work elsewhere, day shifts only. But sometimes when I drive past a brightly lit convenience store in the dead of night, I can't help but wonder what might be watching from inside, waiting for the rare customer or lonely employee to enter its domain. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. This happened to me back in the summer of 2017. The country was experiencing one of the worst heat waves on record, and most people were hiding in air-conditioned spaces, trying to escape the brutal temperatures. As someone who's always been passionate about hiking and camping, I saw this as the perfect opportunity to explore some of the less crowded national parks and set up camp in more remote locations. One of these destinations was a secluded lake in Olympic National Park in Washington State. Without going into too many personal details or revealing my identity, I should mention that in 2016, something related to my job had severely damaged my reputation and resulted in many people developing an intense dislike for me. I had to move apartments, change my phone number, and eventually resign from my position. The mistake I made caused significant financial losses for several people, so the subsequent storm of criticism was inevitable. But I never imagined just how far it would go. For months, I received countless abusive messages from unknown numbers, some even containing threats. I never knew if it was always the same person or a group using different numbers, but I suspected it might be someone determined to harass me. Over time, the messages decreased, and I felt relieved thinking they had finally lost interest or moved on with their lives. At that point, I was unemployed and focusing on self-improvement, which gave me another reason to seek refuge in national parks. During one of my trips, I drove for about 5 hours to reach Olympic National Park. I left my pickup truck in the designated parking area and continued on foot along a trail that led to the lake. There wasn't a single person around. I believe the extreme heat and the fact that it was midweek explained the emptiness. The ground was dusty and cracked from drought, with each step kicking up small clouds of dirt. After hiking for some time, I reached the lake. Despite the scorching temperatures, it was still full and shimmering under the harsh sun, a truly serene sight, and a genuine relief from the accumulated stress in my life. I chose a spot slightly off the trail to set up camp, pitched my tent, gathered some wood, built a small fire pit, though I'd wait until evening to light it, and cooked some canned beans on my portable stove. Later, I sat beside the unlit fire pit to read a book. After going through several chapters, the day began to darken. Fortunately, I had a headlamp that made things much easier. I rolled a joint and started smoking. After a few drags, my phone vibrated. I immediately knew something was wrong since, apart from my family, very few people sent me messages anymore. I pulled the phone from my jacket pocket and was confronted with several messages from an unknown number. My heart raced as I realized it was starting again. The number had an area code 609, which I looked up and found to be from New Jersey. The messages were disturbing. How's the camping trip, friend? The view from here is amazing. Now I see why you came all this way. I immediately replied, who is this? If the first message had been just a casual inquiry about camping, I might have thought it was someone I knew, perhaps a relative or friend. But these messages were strange, as if the person was right there with me. That's when the effects of the marijuana began to hit hard. I was completely stoned, and my anxiety skyrocketed. I became extremely paranoid and started spinning in circles, looking in all directions at the forest, which was now almost completely dark. With the sense of danger intensifying, I opened my backpack and took out my hunting knife. I usually kept it for practical purposes, but now it was my way of feeling more secure. Typically, I would extinguish the fire before going to bed, but with the level of anxiety I was feeling, the idea of being completely in the dark was unbearable. I entered the tent, slipped into my sleeping bag, and stared at those messages on my phone, waiting for a reply that never came. The minutes dragged on, and I just wanted the marijuana's effects to wear off. Still wearing my headlamp, I tried to return to my book where I had left off. But between being high and obsessing over those messages, it was impossible to concentrate. I decided to watch YouTube videos to pass the time. Sleeping wasn't an option. Ironically or not, I ended up choosing a documentary about unsolved disappearances in national parks, which, given the circumstances, probably wasn't the wisest decision. Then, out of nowhere, I received a new message, a response to my question. That doesn't matter anymore. My heart raced again. I immediately responded, how do you know I'm camping? Once more, silence returned. No response. My mind began racing with countless theories. Was it a bad joke played by someone close to me? Or perhaps it was one of the people who had harassed me in the past. But in that case, how would they know where I was? That was the most unsettling part. Meanwhile, I spent about an hour watching more videos on my phone. I noticed that the evening had grown cooler, and I finally decided to light the fire pit. The forest in summer has an eerie tranquility to it. No insect sounds, just the occasional rustling of leaves when a breeze decides to blow. Each time a video on my phone ended, the silence seemed to scream in my ears. On another occasion, I might have enjoyed this peacefulness, but my peace had already been destroyed. Then the silence was broken. There were footsteps on the dry ground, human footsteps. They approached, stopped about 6 feet from the tent, and remained motionless. I already had my knife in hand, ready to use it if necessary. Suddenly, a bright flash illuminated the tent for an instant. It seemed like a flashlight or someone taking a photo. Soon after, I heard the footsteps retreating. Before they completely disappeared, my phone vibrated. It was another message from that number, this time with a photo. The image showed my tent from outside, and then another message came. Sleep tight. At that moment, it was as if the marijuana's effect evaporated. A wave of adrenaline and determination took over me. I unzipped the tent and let out the loudest, most primal scream I could muster, swinging my knife wildly in the air. The sound of hurried footsteps moving away through the brush confirmed that it had worked. I had scared the person off. At the same time, this left me even more disturbed. Whoever it was, they were still nearby. I shouted some threats into the void, and returned inside the tent. Apparently, it worked. I didn't receive any more messages or hear any other footsteps. I stayed awake for hours, unable to relax, feeling as if I had consumed excessive amounts of caffeine. When fatigue finally overcame me, I fell asleep. Waking up to sunlight streaming into the tent, the feeling of relief was indescribable. Whoever had followed me to that place probably didn't expect me to react so aggressively. I definitely don't fit the profile of someone who would confront a stalker. And that primal scream was the first and only time I've ever done something like that. The person who had been bothering me with messages and following me seems to have given up once they realized I was prepared to defend myself. Almost 8 years have passed since then, and I've never been bothered again. Still, that night was a genuine nightmare. I don't even like to think about how things might have ended if I hadn't found the courage to confront my stalker. What makes it even more chilling is what I discovered the next morning. As I was packing up my campsite, I noticed something hanging from a tree branch about 30 yards from my tent, my wallet, which I hadn't even realized was missing from my backpack. Attached to it was a note that simply read, "Next time." I reported the incident to the park rangers, but without any concrete evidence beyond some text messages from an untraceable number, there wasn't much they could do. I've continued camping and hiking over the years, but never alone. And I always make sure someone knows exactly where I am at all times. The most disturbing part, sometimes I still wonder if they're watching, just waiting for me to let my guard down one more time. It was almost midnight when Ethan called me. His voice was hollow and hesitant, revealing he had sunk into a profound depression. I couldn't turn my back on him. Having faced my own dark moments, I knew how devastating loneliness could be during such times. "Let's go get some drinks to distract your mind," I suggested. He agreed but quickly added, "I'm completely broke right now." Before heading to his place, I stopped at a liquor store and bought a bottle of whiskey, a pack of cigarettes, and some snacks. When I arrived, he greeted me with a visibly forced smile. "Let's go to the backyard," he said. "But close your eyes, my house is a disaster." I didn't obey, of course, and noticed he wasn't exaggerating. The environment clearly reflected the internal chaos he was experiencing. Without commenting, I simply followed him to the back of the house. The yard was spacious and shrouded in darkness, with tall trees whose shadows seemed to come alive under the pale moonlight. Foxes darted freely among the undergrowth, their movements difficult to track between the bushes. We sat beneath one of the trees, and Ethan began to unburden himself while sipping the whiskey. He spoke of his financial difficulties, how he had been accumulating debts for years and could no longer see a way out. I offered financial help, but he rejected it without hesitation. "I don't want to lose your friendship," he said. "I've accepted money from others before, and when I couldn't pay them back, they disappeared from my life." He fell silent for several moments before revealing something that caught me completely off guard. "I have a plan," he whispered, leaning closer. "I read online that spirits can help. That's why I like sitting under this oak tree. I've seen strange things here. I think they live here. I'm going to leave sweets, alcohol, and cigarettes to win them over." I asked if he truly believed in such things, and if he was certain about what he was doing. Ethan claimed he had found a detailed ritual on an obscure online forum. I tried to convince him to research more thoroughly before doing something so unusual, but he seemed determined, smoking calmly while staring fixedly at the tree, nodding his head in subtle approval. "Maybe you're right. It could be dangerous," he said without averting his gaze. Time passed, and around 3 in the morning, I decided to leave. I hadn't walked far when Ethan called again. His voice was laden with terror. "Come back, please." "I'm scared," the call dropped. I rushed back as quickly as possible, fearing the worst, knowing that in his state he might act impulsively. When I arrived, Ethan was in a state of panic, sweating, trembling, with eyes wide open. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep him calm. He pointed with a shaking hand toward the yard. "Look, but don't make any noise." Carefully, I approached the window. At first, I perceived nothing beyond the trees swaying in the wind. But then I heard voices whispering Ethan's name in a disturbingly inhuman manner. "I made a pact," he stammered, terror etched across his face. "I left offerings. They appeared when I was about to finish the ritual." I asked if he had consumed anything that might cause hallucinations, but he vehemently denied it. Before I could press further, a bone-chilling sound invaded the house. Harsh voices like those of ancient beings calling Ethan from near the oak tree. There were many, chaotic, each word saturated with malice. Ethan remained paralyzed, staring out the window while I crouched on the floor, too petrified to risk another look. "They're there," he murmured. "There are so many of them. What should I do?" Before I could respond, he collapsed unconscious. I tried to lift him, but his body was heavy as stone. The voices grew closer, and the sound of footsteps crushing leaves on the ground filled me with dread. I grabbed my phone to record everything, but the device shut off by itself. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the previous sounds. Desperate, I shouted that Ethan was unconscious, begging them to leave him in peace and go away. A few minutes later, Ethan awakened. To my surprise, he was strangely calm. He told me to leave, assuring me that he knew what to do. "I've got this under control now," he said with unnerving serenity. I tried to convince him to come with me, but he refused with a disconcerting tranquility, stating that all he needed to do was recite Psalm 23 for everything to be all right. It seemed he had resorted to this before. Several weeks later, I encountered him at a high-end restaurant in the city. He was unrecognizable, elegant clothes, new tattoos, a confident posture that bordered on arrogance. He appeared genuinely happy and wasn't alone. A stunning woman accompanied him. Later that evening, he called to say his life was excellent and that he owed everything to his foxes. Then he sent me a photo of the animals. They were under the same oak tree, sitting as if they were people, cigarettes held between their teeth, with expressions that verged on human, something sarcastic and frightening. A shiver ran down my spine when I saw it. I asked what it meant, and he explained that they communicated with him through the foxes. He said the animals were like messengers, and as bizarre as it seemed, he felt no fear. According to Ethan, the offering he had made had been accepted, and now everything was better. Before ending the call and blocking me on all social media, he left one final statement. "With them by my side, things will only get better." 3 months later, I learned of his death. He was found in his backyard, the victim of a heart attack, while the foxes were devouring his body. Since then, I cannot forget what happened under that oak tree, nor the shadows that Ethan saw. Sometimes in my nightmares, I hear the same voices from that night, calling my name. Sometimes I wonder if I should visit that oak tree myself. I've been having financial problems lately, and the thought of an easy solution becomes more tempting each passing day. But then I remember Ethan's eyes in that photo, how they seemed hollow, as if something else was staring back at me through them. Last night, a fox appeared in my garden. It sat there watching me, a cigarette butt near its paw. I closed the curtains and locked all the doors, but I could still feel its eyes on me, waiting. I know I should move away from this neighborhood, but something keeps me here. Perhaps curiosity, or perhaps something else entirely. Either way, I've started researching old prayers, just in case. When I was a child, our family had an annual tradition every April. We would take a trip to the mountains of eastern Tennessee, choosing a weekend when we could all gather at my Aunt Eliza's property, a sprawling 10 acres of woodland retreat. The farmhouse she maintained there was spacious, with 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, perfect for accommodating everyone. 2 of the bedrooms were reserved for us kids. My brother and I shared one, while our 3 cousins occupied the other. The adults took the remaining rooms. My Aunt Eliza was a wildlife photographer and naturalist who regularly traveled to document animals in various parts of the country. My mother occasionally joined her on these excursions, despite not being particularly outdoorsy herself. She was the type who wouldn't harm even a spider, carefully capturing and releasing any that found their way into the house. Aunt Eliza's property included a vast stretch of forest, marked by trees painted with blue bands indicating the boundary line. Beyond that was county wilderness, with miles of isolation until the nearest neighbor's house. Or at least that's how it seemed to us kids. One day, while we were having lunch and the adults were discussing wildlife tracking, my brother Dylan, our cousins, and I had the idea to spend the night camping in the forest. To our surprise, our parents agreed. They had already had a few glasses of wine, which certainly made the yes come easier. Our fathers weren't entirely comfortable with the idea, but didn't directly forbid it either. So my aunt and my uncle Peter took us into the forest with a tent. Only us boys participated in the adventure. My sister and my female cousin preferred to stay in the house. The hike seemed long, especially for Mason, the youngest of our group, who didn't take long to start complaining. Our parents laughed at the situation as they always did when together, especially after a few drinks. I was 12 years old and the oldest of the group. Dylan and Liam were around 9, while Mason, the youngest, was about 7. We ventured past the property boundary to a small clearing that my aunt called Deer Beds. She explained it was an area covered with a soft type of moss, ideal for camping, and mentioned she had used the spot before. There, our aunt and uncle improvised a somewhat clumsy lesson, teaching us how to set up the tent. Of course, we had to help, no just watching aloud. The tent was spacious enough for 4 children, and each of us arranged our sleeping bag inside. We did this before darkness fell, as it would have been much more complicated at night. Back at the house, we played outside until dinner time, During the meal, our mothers again expressed concern that the idea didn't seem safe, emphasizing that we were too young to stay alone in the forest. But our aunt and uncle assured them everything would be fine. I even remember my uncle joking that we would be close enough for them to hear our screams if anything went wrong. When it got dark, they led us back to the tent, carrying flashlights and extra blankets since the spring nights were cold. I also brought a deck of Uno cards, thinking about how we would pass the time. Once we were settled in the tent, my aunt and uncle left us alone. And there we were, 4 boys in the middle of the forest. Although our parents had said we weren't that far from the house, the truth was different. There was no sign of light or sound coming from there. We were immersed in the darkness and silence of the woods. We spent a good amount of time playing Uno, perhaps about 45 minutes or more. The game was perfect for distracting us, and the environment inside the tent, illuminated by our flashlights arranged in a circle, seemed cozy. Everything was going well until we heard a distant scream. It sounded like a young woman, which left us paralyzed. We looked at each other, confused and tense. I remembered that foxes can emit screams that sound like human voices, and mentioned this to reassure the others. It worked, although I noticed that Mason was clearly shaken. We returned to the game, and I won almost every round. No one mentioned the scream again, as if we wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. But then the sound returned, this time louder and much closer. Now it seemed undeniably human. We stopped again, and this time even I felt fear taking over. Mason was on the verge of tears. I decided we should turn off the flashlights. We crawled into our sleeping bags and remained completely in the dark. Nobody wanted to risk running back to the house. The fear of attracting attention with the noise of footsteps was greater than the dread of staying there. As fragile as it was, the tent seemed like our best protection. Silence took over, but not for long. Liam was trying to ask if the sound really came from a fox. I admitted that I wasn't sure, though I hoped it was. It was then that we all simultaneously noticed the sound of rapid footsteps crushing dry leaves, coming straight toward us. The footsteps abruptly stopped outside the tent, and then came the scream, high-pitched, terrifying, like that of a woman. The tent began to shake violently, and our screams filled the air. Mason and Liam yelled in terror, while Dylan and I shouted orders. I jumped out of the tent, opened the zipper as fast as I could, and we all ran out toward the house, illuminating the path with our flashlights. It was the most desperate run of my life, with that feeling that something could catch up to us at any moment. We screamed the entire way, and upon reaching the property, we saw that our parents were already outside, alarmed by our cries. We told them what happened, the sounds, the shaking tent, the fear. By the shocked look on their faces, I realized something. My cousin Mia and my sister weren't outside with the adults. I immediately accused my uncle of having sent them to scare us, but they assured us the girls were already asleep. That's when it became clear. Someone, a stranger, was in the forest. The adults grabbed their shotguns and went to investigate, but returned after some time without finding anything. The next morning, we dismantled the tent and brought everything back to the house. It was the first and last time we camped in that forest. After that, we never played outside at night again. Who would dare after experiencing something like that? To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there that night, nor why they did it. But whatever it was, I will never forget that scream or the violent shaking of our tent in the darkness of those Tennessee woods. Years later, when I mentioned the incident to my aunt, she grew strangely quiet before admitting that there had been stories about that section of the forest tales of hikers hearing a woman's screams in the night. She'd never believed them until our experience. The local rangers had investigated reports over the years, but never found any explanation. Sometimes I wonder if we should have gone back as adults to face whatever haunted those woods. But the memory of that night still sends chills down my spine, and I suspect it always will. I'd be happy to rewrite the story in English with your requested changes. Let me transform it into a first-person narrative set in a different time and place, while maintaining the overall plot structure and making it slightly longer with some unpredictable elements. For years, I worked at a well-known retail corporation, employed as a custodian. I was 23 at the time, and despite my shift being during regular daytime hours, I frequently overheard conversations among the night shift employees about strange occurrences. They claimed that mysterious things would appear. Voices would echo throughout the underground parking garage, in the basement storage areas, and even in the restrooms. These stories were always shared casually, almost like workplace legends, and I had never experienced anything unusual myself, since my routine always involved working alongside other people. As time passed, I was assigned to maintain the restroom areas, which had a peculiar L-shaped layout. To enter, you had to push through a heavy door, walk down a narrow corridor, and then turn right at the end, where an enormous mirror stretched across the wall, easily 15 feet in length. The sinks were equipped with motion sensors. The toilet stalls faced directly opposite the mirror, and the stall doors had sliding locks. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. One Friday night in late autumn, due to staffing shortages, I agreed to cover the night shift along with a few colleagues. The building was practically empty, except for us, and a single security guard stationed in the lobby. The night progressed uneventfully as we completed our tasks, but when it came time to finish up, we needed to go downstairs to store our cleaning supplies. I noticed that Emma, a colleague with whom I developed a good friendship, hadn't come down yet. Thinking she might need help, I went looking for her and discovered she was supposed to be cleaning the restrooms on the upper floors. I climbed the stairs to find her, but upon reaching the 5th floor, there was no sign of her presence. I decided to check the restrooms to let her know it was time to leave. When I opened the door to one of the larger restrooms, I was surprised to find it completely dark. Something unusual, since the lights were only turned off after cleaning was completely finished. I assumed she wasn't there, but before I could close the door again, I heard the distinctive sound of multiple faucets turning on simultaneously. Then, without warning, one of the stall doors slammed shut with such force that the entire room seemed to vibrate. I didn't wait to investigate further. My heart pounding in my chest, I sprinted down 5 flights of stairs to the ground floor as quickly as my legs would carry me. To my absolute shock, I found Emma already downstairs, chatting with our supervisor. She had been there for at least 20 minutes. "Where were you just now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been down here the whole time," she replied, looking confused by my panicked state. "I finished the fourth-floor restrooms almost half an hour ago." Why, we never discovered what caused those inexplicable events that night. The security footage showed no one entering or leaving the fifth-floor restrooms after Emma had finished. The building's maintenance team found nothing wrong with the plumbing or door hinges when they checked the following Monday. After that night, I requested a permanent transfer back to the day shift. Despite the years that have passed, I can't help but remember those whispered rumors from the night shift workers, and wonder what else might wander those empty corridors after dark when most have gone home. Blackwater Institute stands where the bitter cold mingles with gusts from the Great Lakes. For more than 8 decades, it has been a beacon of knowledge, but also a magnet for scandal. Founded in the post-war era, its history carries a shadowy chapter from the early days of its medical school. While they were making breakthroughs in pharmacology, terrible practices also marked its trajectory. Disturbing stories began to surface. Vulnerable people, transients, and local scavengers disappeared without explanation. Reports suggested they were lured to campus with promises of help or meals, only to become victims of inhuman experiments. The truth emerged when a survivor, beaten and near death, escaped and revealed the horrors he had witnessed. More than 90 bodies were discovered in clandestine graves. Some had been dismembered, others sold for medical practices. Police confirmed the facts were even more terrifying than rumors had indicated. Over time, it seemed these episodes had been left in the past, but students and staff began reporting unsettling sensations: shadowy figures in the corridors, anguished whispers during the night, and that constant feeling of being watched. "It's the weight of souls who suffered unjustly here," they would say. Among the most impactful accounts is my uncle's experience, who worked as a night watchman at the Institute around 40 years ago. One evening, 2 professors asked for help with moving equipment in the laboratory. Not suspecting anything unusual, he asked a colleague named Morris to go in his place. Minutes later, terrible screams echoed through the building. Racing to the scene, my uncle found the professors and 2 other men brutally attacking his colleague. Terrified, he was threatened with death if he spoke about what he'd seen. Fearing for his life, he chose to remain silent. Days later, while making his rounds, he arrived at the anatomy laboratory. The poorly lit corridor cast sinister shadows on the walls, amplifying the tension in the air. Inside the lab, something on one of the tables caught his attention: a human mannequin. Though it was actually a real body without skin, carefully preserved for anatomical studies. A chill ran down his spine when he noticed something disturbingly familiar about that body. Drawing closer, overcome by a mixture of disbelief and horror, he murmured, "It looks like Morris." The silence was broken by a muffled, grotesque sound, something like a gurgle. Then a hoarse voice, heavy with pain, echoed in the room. "It is me." Frozen with terror, he turned quickly toward the voice. There stood Morris, or what remained of him. His body was mangled, skin hanging in pieces, eyes sunken into bloody sockets. Morris's gaze carried sadness and the weight of accusation. My uncle tried to scream, but no sound came out. He could barely breathe, much less move. Morris extended a bloodied hand, pointing to the body on the table. "That's my body," he said in a voice calm, yet strangely disturbing. Morris's figure gradually disappeared before my uncle's eyes, leaving behind an unbearable smell of burnt flesh and putrefaction. When he was able to react, he ran from the laboratory without looking back. That same night, he submitted his resignation and left for a distant city, seeking not just safety but anonymity. Before leaving, he tried to report the incident to authorities, but his story was treated as the product of a disturbed mind. The most unsettling detail: the plastinated body remained in the laboratory. Students claim it's still there, displayed in a showcase as teaching material for anatomy classes, and nobody dares ask where it came from. With the passage of time, those grotesque practices finally ceased. Advances in technology and stricter controls made continuation of the experiments impossible, coupled with the fact that the corrupt figures who permitted them were no longer in command. This, however, brought little relief to the institution's reputation. The label Institute of Human Experiments gave way to another equally frightening one: the Institute of Suicides. Every year without fail, between 7 and 8 students would jump from the 8th floor of Block D, the site of the worst atrocities. The notes they left behind were similar, always conveying suffering that seemed greater than any logical explanation. But what really caused shivers were the events preceding these tragedies. Silhouettes gliding along walls, muffled laughter echoing through empty corridors, and the figure of a humanoid creature with enormous wings, and a deformed face seen by a select few. I myself witnessed one of these cases. It was the 8th that year. A young man threw himself off and remained writhing on the ground for several minutes. As he struggled for his last breaths, a terrifying figure emerged from the shadows, a gigantic bird with a horribly distorted face. It landed beside the body and seemed to observe it attentively, as if assessing the result of its work. Then it simply vanished. The vision was terrifying, like looking directly into the eyes of death and seeing it satisfied with its work. Remembering the young man's desperate final attempts to breathe provokes uncontrollable fear and suffocating anxiety in me. This year so far, there have been no victims, but rumors circulate like a whisper in the air. It's just a matter of time. The pattern never fails. 7 or 8 students hurl themselves from the 8th floor, as if an invisible force were leading them to the abyss. During my 4 years in law school, I witnessed this macabre cycle repeat without interruption. Neither memorial services for the victims, nor the lights kept on in the corridors seemed capable of preventing the darkness from returning. The legends grow with time, fed by new students who arrive and hear accounts from those who lived through the horror of Block D. It has become the nucleus of an endless pattern of death, an open wound that seems to have no cure. Perhaps Blackwater Institute is destined to carry this mark forever, trapped in a cycle where the past continues to return to haunt the present. The echoes of those who departed still whisper through the corridors, secrets no one dares to hear, and Block D waits in silence, patient for the next student who will come too close to the edge, so that the cycle of tragedies may continue. During a chapter of my life, I worked as a night security guard at a checkpoint booth, for an upscale gated community in a quiet suburb of Boston. My shift, running from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, was typically uneventful. My main responsibility was to verify vehicles entering the property, whether residents or visitors, and occasionally communicate via radio with my colleague Marcus, who manned the second checkpoint at the rear entrance. Everything seemed routine until one particular night that still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. At the same time, I feel somewhat embarrassed for allowing myself to become so frightened. Deep down, we all know that night work exposes us to sounds and situations that can toy with the imagination. But we're supposed to stay calm and not give in to superstitions. That night, the clock showed around 3 in the morning on a bitterly cold Thursday in late January. I was watching television, trying to pass the time, when suddenly I heard a female voice through the radio, something completely unexpected. "Daniel," at first, I thought it must be some technical problem, perhaps interference in the signal. But before I could process what was happening, the same voice repeated itself, now clearer. "Daniel." That's when I felt the first chill run through my body. It's worth mentioning that only Marcus and I had access to this radio channel, and he wasn't the type to play practical jokes, especially during the dead of night. I picked up the device and asked who was speaking. I heard Marcus responding calmly, asking if I needed something. I told him it was nothing, that I must have been confused. His calm response reinforced that this wasn't some prank. Even so, something continued to make me uneasy. "Daniel," now the voice seemed to be coming from outside, as if it were right beyond the glass of my booth. Panic took hold of me when I began to hear knocking on the door, accompanied by the female voice repeating my name. I won't lie, the fear was so intense that it made me fall out of my chair. I was completely paralyzed, unable to react. Still on the floor, I saw headlights illuminating the booth. The presence of that vehicle brought me some relief, because it meant someone was nearby. It was one of the residents, Dr. Whitman, an elderly gentleman who was always polite and kind. He stepped out of his car, greeted me, and asked if everything was all right. Embarrassed, I admitted that I had been frightened, but downplayed it by saying it must have been a product of my imagination after 12 straight nights on shift. He let out a sigh before telling me something disturbing. "You know, this isn't the first time episodes like this have happened at this hour," he said, his voice lowered as if sharing a secret. According to him, it wasn't just the security guards who faced strange situations. Residents who arrived late at night also reported seeing an elderly woman wearing something resembling hospital attire standing near the small pond adjacent to my checkpoint. Nobody knew who she was or why she appeared. The strangest part was that many claimed to see her vanish in the exact spot where she stood. Dr. Whitman commented that he had never heard of the woman calling someone by name or approaching the checkpoints before. Before leaving, he reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a silver pendant with a cross. He handed it to me, saying I should hang it on the door of the booth because he believed it might help. I thanked him, immediately hung the pendant outside without hesitation, and immediately radioed Marcus to tell him everything. At that moment, embarrassment no longer mattered. I just needed to share this experience with someone. When I told Marcus what had happened, he asked why I thought he had never experienced anything similar. He explained that since he started working there 2 years ago, he had received a similar pendant to hang on his door, specifically because of these stories. He said that, in fact, it had been quite some time since anyone had mentioned anything about this woman, which perhaps explained why nobody had instructed me to do the same. That ended up being my last night at that job. The voice of that woman echoed in my mind whenever I thought about the early morning hours, and I simply couldn't ignore the discomfort anymore. I handed in my resignation the next day. 3 weeks later, I was reading the local paper when I came across a small article about the history of our community. Apparently, the gated neighborhood had been built on the grounds of what was once a private psychiatric facility, closed down in the late 70s. The article mentioned that one patient, an elderly woman named Catherine Daniel, had wandered off during a winter night and was found frozen by the small pond the following morning. I still don't know what to make of my experience that night. I've started working day shifts at a downtown office building since then. The pay is worse, but at least when someone calls my name, I can see who's doing it. This is a story that has left deep marks on my family, bringing shivers and unanswered questions even to this day. My name is Michael, and what I'm about to tell you happened in 1953 in a small town called Blackwater Creek, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. It was there that my grandmother Alina lived through something we still cannot fully comprehend. Grandmother Alina was a woman of unwavering spirit and iron determination. She was widowed very young and raised her 3 children, including my mother, all by herself. She worked as a seamstress from her home, leading a modest life, while always reminding us that her true wealth was the health of her children. Life in that small mountain town, surrounded by ancient forests and even more ancient traditions, was generally peaceful, though filled with mysteries and stories that seemed to dwell in the shadows of those old hills. Everything began on a crisp September morning. My grandmother left early for the town market, carrying some of her handmade quilts to sell. The path to town was a narrow trail shadowed by towering oak trees. Many locals avoided walking it alone, frightened by tales of strange apparitions. Alina was never one to be easily intimidated. That day, as she walked carrying her handmade quilts, she noticed something unusual. Sitting at the side of the path was an elderly woman with completely silver hair, wearing old-fashioned clothes that hadn't been in style for decades. She was seated on a small wooden stool with a basket covered by an intricately embroidered handkerchief in front of her. The woman lifted her face and smiled at my grandmother in a way that, according to Alina, was simultaneously welcoming and deeply unsettling. "Good morning, ma'am," the old woman greeted with a firm yet serene voice. "Are you headed to the market?" My grandmother, somewhat suspicious, replied that yes, she was on her way to sell her quilts and wanted to know what the other woman was doing there so early. The elderly woman maintained her smile and explained, "I'm waiting here for those who need help." She then asked, "What is your name?" Alina hesitated, but eventually told her. The woman nodded slowly, as if savoring each letter, and commented, "Alina is a strong name. You protect your children, but not all paths are simple. Trust that there is always a way forward." These words left my grandmother uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite say why. The elderly woman then leaned forward, opened her basket, and took out a small, round wooden amulet. "Keep this," she said. "It will protect you against what cannot be seen, but is always around us." Even though she was skeptical, my grandmother accepted it. There was something in the woman's gaze that made it seem impossible to refuse. Before Alina could say anything more, the old woman spoke again. "Continue on your way, Alina. We will meet again." Upon reaching the market, my grandmother tried to forget the encounter. She sold her quilts and returned home around noon. However, that very night, while preparing dinner, something strange happened. She heard a faint whispering coming from her children's room. She rushed there, but they were all sleeping soundly. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. The next day, while sewing near the window, the whispers returned, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice repeating names that my grandmother didn't recognize. Names like Abigail Thornton, William Mercer, and Sarah Jenkins. Old-fashioned names that seemed to echo from another time. That night, my grandmother decided to place the pendant given by the elderly woman above her children's beds, believing it might protect them. The whispers stopped. However, the following day, as she went out to gather firewood, she saw the woman again. She was in exactly the same place, at the edge of the path. "Alina, is everything in order at your home?" asked the old woman, her tone now more serious. "I heard strange things," my grandmother replied, trying to hide her unease. "Voices whispering names I don't know." The elderly woman nodded with a knowing look and said, "Souls that cannot find rest seek someone who can hear them. The pendant keeps those presences away, but there is something you must do for them. If you don't, they will return." A chill ran through Alina, who then asked what she should do. The woman answered enigmatically, "You must find the forgotten place where they sleep. Speak their names aloud so they can finally rest. The names you hear are those who were buried without proper remembrance, some nearly a century ago. Find where they lie beneath the earth. Only then will they find peace." That night, my grandmother lit a candle before the pendant, prayed fervently, and asked for guidance and protection. During her prayer, a vivid image appeared in her mind. A field full of rustic crosses, like forgotten graves overgrown with wild mountain, laurel, and thorny vines. The vision was so real that Alina felt her breath catch. She understood there was something hidden that needed to be brought to light. In the days that followed, Alina tried to understand what it all meant. The field of crosses wouldn't leave her mind and robbed her of sleep. Determined to find answers, she returned to the spot where she always met the old woman, but she was no longer there. What she found instead was the wooden stool left under the old oak tree. On it rested an embroidered handkerchief similar to the one that had covered the basket, and a note written in elegant, old-fashioned handwriting. "Seek the earth where the forgotten rest. They need their names to be remembered." Though mysterious, the message brought to mind the vision of the crosses. My grandmother began asking the townspeople if they knew of such a place. That's when Ezekiel, an elderly man who had lived there for decades, provided an important clue. "There's an old burial ground near Stillwater Creek," he said, his voice lowered as if sharing a secret. "Nobody goes there. They say it's where they buried those without family, or those who died tragically during the mining disaster of 1885. Maybe that's what you're looking for. That afternoon, Alina gathered her courage and went to Stillwater Creek. There she found a forgotten plot of land overtaken by weeds, practically invisible from the main road. It was exactly as in her vision, simple wooden crosses, weathered by time, many without names and others with inscriptions almost erased. The place exuded a dense sadness, as if time had left deep scars in the soil. My grandmother lit the candles she had brought and began to pray aloud, pronouncing each name she could decipher on the crosses. As she did so, a strange sensation took hold of the environment, as if the air around her became lighter. Suddenly a murmur arose, similar to the whispers she had heard at home, but this time clearer. "Thank you," said a woman's voice. Alina looked around, but there was no one there. Yet something seemed different, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the place. The crosses, which had been leaning at odd angles, now seemed to stand straighter. The overgrown weeds suddenly appeared less tangled, as if they had been recently tended. When she returned to town, everything was quiet again. The whispers had definitely ceased, and peace reigned in her home. Still, my grandmother never stopped wondering who the elderly woman was, and how she knew so much about what was to come. Weeks later, while on her way to the market, Alina encountered the mysterious woman again. Seated on the same wooden stool with the basket still covered by the embroidered handkerchief. However, something about her was different. Her appearance was younger, and there was a luminosity that made her seem almost radiant. Her silver hair now had streaks of deep chestnut, and the wrinkles that had etched her face seemed smoothed away. "You did what needed to be done, Alina," the woman said before my grandmother could even open her mouth. Speaking their names brought rest to them. Now you can follow your path without fear. Alina felt a deep desire to thank her and discover who she really was. But before she could say anything, the woman raised her hand with a gentle gesture, asking for silence. It is not necessary to know. Just remember that sometimes souls seek help in ways we don't understand. Now go. Your children are waiting. When my grandmother took a step toward the woman, something extraordinary happened. The elderly woman began to fade, becoming translucent as morning mist. Alina watched in astonishment as the figure grew dimmer until she disappeared completely, as if she had never been there. The wooden stool and the embroidered handkerchief were the only things left behind. My grandmother decided to keep the handkerchief as a memento of that enigmatic encounter. When she examined it later, she discovered something she hadn't noticed before. Embroidered along the edge in almost invisible stitching were the same names she had heard whispered: Abigail Thornton, William Mercer, Sarah Jenkins, and dozens more. Even more startling was the date carefully sewn into one corner: 1885, the year of the mining disaster Ezekiel had mentioned. Over the years, Alina shared this story with us, always with the intention of reminding us that even in the strangest and most inexplicable situations, there are forces that guide and protect us. The wooden pendant and the embroidered handkerchief are still in our family, and each time we see them, we remember the Lady of the Names and the power that exists in giving voice and memory to those who are no longer among us. Years later, my grandmother made one final discovery about her mysterious encounter. While researching town records for a family history project, she found an old newspaper article about the mining disaster. Among the names of those who had helped recover bodies from the collapsed mine was a woman named Margaret Blackwood, described as an elderly resident known for her kindness and healing ways. The grainy photograph accompanying the article showed a woman seated on a wooden stool with a basket beside her. Her face lined with age, but her eyes bright with an inner light. The article mentioned that Margaret had gone missing shortly after the disaster, with some claiming she had simply moved away, while others insisted she had been seen wandering near the unmarked graves, whispering names of the dead. Whatever the truth, my grandmother always believed that sometimes, when the need is great enough, the barriers between this world and the next become thin enough for help to cross over. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you walk that old path to Blackwater Creek in the early morning mist, they say you might glimpse an elderly woman sitting on a wooden stool, waiting for those who need her help. What I'm about to share still makes me question what's real. It was something my father and I experienced, and even 3 years later, I feel a chill down my spine when I remember it. I understand if you find it strange. I myself would hesitate to believe it, but I guarantee that every detail is true. 3 years ago, my father and I decided to go camping in a remote location in northern Minnesota. We enjoyed these escapes to disconnect from our routine. This specific place had its charm: hiking trails, zip lines, and a touristy atmosphere. But it was also steeped in history since it was on former Ojibwe tribal lands. The first night was peaceful, campgrounds full, fires lit, children laughing. It was exactly what we expected: a calm and pleasant evening. We made hot dogs, roasted marshmallows, drank whiskey, and chatted with other campers. It was the perfect setting to relax. On the second night, everything changed. The staff informed us that we would be the only ones in the park, since there were no more reservations. Initially, we thought it was great, an entire place just for us. We spent the day exploring trails, fishing, and enjoying ourselves. At one point, we listened to a horror podcast by the river just to add a touch of suspense to the day, laughing at our own idea. When the sun began to disappear, we were tired, our bodies aching from hiking, but happy. We decided to go to the park's information center to charge our phones and grab some snacks before returning to the campsite. The return journey was when everything started to feel strange. The forest seemed different. The air was dense, and the sky had an unusual color, as if dusk had frozen in time. My father commented, "Doesn't it seem like something's out of place?" Like in a strange dream, he was right. The woods seemed endless, and an uncomfortable sensation dominated me, as if something was watching us. We fell silent, our eyes scanning the environment as we walked, alert to every shadow. Upon reaching the campsite, we gathered around the fire, trying to act normally. We avoided talking about the tension in the air, as if ignoring it would dispel the discomfort. We roasted more marshmallows, played music, and even smoked a little marijuana to relax. It wasn't a typical father-son activity, but at that moment it seemed appropriate. Then around 10 at night, we heard something. A thunderous boom echoed through the woods, like the sound of a tree falling. It was close, maybe 300 feet away, coming from the direction of the river. We grabbed our flashlights and illuminated the area, but saw only emptiness, no movement, no eye reflection, nothing. We joked that it might be Bigfoot, but the laughter was more nervous than sincere. And then the sound repeated, louder this time, but coming from a more distant point. Again, we pointed our flashlights, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything. The trees around us were all we could see. Then came the third boom, much closer. It was at this moment that true fear took over. Whatever it was, it seemed to be circling our campsite. We barely had time to think when the fourth noise sounded, perhaps 60 feet away. It was as if a wave of adrenaline took over. Any effect of the marijuana disappeared instantly. When I looked at my father's face, his wide eyes betrayed the terror he felt. Without needing to exchange many words, we agreed that we should get into the tent. In an impulse, we threw the remaining firewood onto the fire, hoping the flames would keep whatever it was away. Then we ran to the tent, leaving everything behind. I threw myself onto the ground, breathless, while my father came right behind, more cautious. But just as he was entering, the loudest sound of all exploded, so close that the ground vibrated. He paused for a moment, staring into the darkness. "Dad," I whispered, trying to pull him out of that trance. He finally entered and zipped up the tent, murmuring, "There's something standing out there." "What is it?" I asked. "I don't know," he replied, his voice breaking, but it looked like a wall of darkness. My father positioned himself near the entrance while I tried to hide inside my sleeping bag. He held the only thing we had to defend ourselves, a small, insignificant knife, but it was all we had. It was then that it began, something difficult to describe. A deep vibration, almost like a hum, but not just a sound. It was a physical sensation, as if the air around us had weight, pressing on our chests and making it difficult to breathe. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I just nodded, unable to make any sound. The atmosphere was one of pure dread, as if we were being watched, hunted. It seemed that any wrong move would be fatal. We stayed like this for about 15 minutes, until another sound emerged, different from anything we had ever heard. It didn't seem human or animal. It was something guttural, grotesque, with an alien tone. I always compare it to the roar of a demogorgon. It was simply inexplicable. We froze, pinned to the floor of the tent, trying to even breathe. Beside me was a small mesh window, but I didn't have the courage to look outside. The fear of being seen was greater. I remained there, focused on keeping my breathing controlled, while my father continued to grip the knife tightly. And then the strangest thing happened. We simply blacked out. We don't remember closing our eyes or trying to sleep. When I woke up, it was as if a button had been pressed. My father was still holding the knife, and I woke with my heart racing, as if someone was pressing on my chest. My first reaction was to look for my cell phone, but it was dead despite having been fully charged the night before. I asked my father to check his, but it was also discharged. We left the tent to urinate, but stayed a few steps from each other, backs turned to ensure no one surprised us. The sky was still dark, as if the night had extended. The air was still and freezing. Everything seemed unchanged. The food on the table was untouched, and the fire we had fed was reduced to ashes, as if nothing had approached it. The feeling was that we didn't belong in that place. We spent the rest of the night in the tent in almost absolute silence, just trying to truly rest without much success. When the sun finally came up, we began to pack our things in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. We didn't exchange a word until we were in the car, ready to leave that place. It was only on the road, when the tension began to diminish, that we talked about what had happened. We discovered that we both shared the same feeling from that night, the distinct impression of being watched, hunted, as if something was lurking, waiting for the right moment to act. When we got home, we told everything to my mother, but she just laughed, thinking it was a delusion, that perhaps we had been exposed to some drug or inhaled some strange gas. But it wasn't that. Whatever happened, that night was real. We both lived exactly the same experience. To this day, we cannot understand what it was. We never got to clearly see what was there. But my father saw something up close, and he insists it wasn't human or something that could be considered natural. Since then, we've searched for reports of similar stories, but never found anything that resembles what we went through. We also haven't returned to that place, nor have we ventured to another campground. I think deep down, we know we never will. But something even stranger happened last week. I received a small package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a small carved wooden figure that resembled nothing I've ever seen before. A twisted, elongated shape with what looked like multiple limbs. And a note that simply read, "You were chosen. It's watching. It always watches. I haven't told my father about it yet. I'm afraid of what it might mean. Afraid that whatever was in those woods that night has somehow found us again. Sometimes at night, I think I can hear that same vibration, that same weight in the air. And I wonder, was it ever really gone?" I never imagined becoming the protagonist of a true nightmare. I've decided to share this story because it has never left my mind. What we experienced that night changed how I see the world and the limits of what's possible. I was like many others, skeptical of anything supernatural. Even after hearing accounts from trustworthy people and witnessing some inexplicable situations myself, I never seriously considered that such things could be real. But life has ways of changing our certainties, and the day came when I became that person, someone who shares their experience, while facing the skeptical glances of those who would only believe if they saw with their own eyes. If you want to know the truth, although I hope you trust my words, I wouldn't wish what I experienced on anyone, not even those who labeled me insane, both me and the others who witnessed what I'm about to relate. Everything happened just a few miles from Ashland, Oregon, in a popular camping destination deep in the Cascade Mountains. I won't mention the exact location. Curiosity might draw unprepared people to a danger they shouldn't face. My story begins on a camping trip I reluctantly joined at the last minute during the fall of 1997. It was a gathering of my girlfriend Rebecca's friends. She always enjoyed going out with Sarah and Lily for these adventures, usually accompanied by Nathan, Sarah's boyfriend, and Marcus, who had been in an on-again, off-again relationship with Lily since I'd known them. Even during the worst moments of their relationship, Marcus and Lily shared a passion for camping. However, on this particular occasion, an especially serious fight made Marcus back out of the trip. With everything already planned, Rebecca called and asked me to come along. She knew how much I hated camping. I couldn't stand the discomfort of spending days away from a decent bed just to enjoy nature. Despite this, she insisted, saying she had a bad feeling and needed me there. Not because they needed another man in the group, but because she trusted me to take care of her. It was impossible to say no. I notified my family, finished some work tasks, and hurried to Sarah's house, our meeting point. From the beginning, I sensed something strange. I thought it was just fallout from Lily and Marcus's fight, but it soon became clear there was something more. An invisible tension hanging in the air, difficult to ignore and impossible to explain. Despite any feelings of apprehension that surrounded us, no one even considered canceling the trip. After all, who would really do that? Everyone was certain that once we reached the forest, the fresh air, imposing trees and distance from the urban routine, would relieve any discomfort. During the journey, we set aside our fears, laughing and exchanging jokes. When we parked the truck and followed the trail in search of a place to camp, the mood was much lighter. Perhaps this momentary relaxation caused us to make decisions I now deeply regret. The spot they usually used was occupied. We continued onward and found other groups, but one in particular seemed to be there just to drink and make noise. I remember either Sarah or Lily commenting that if we stayed there, it would only be a matter of time before we got irritated or ran into trouble. It was then that Nathan suggested a more isolated place, where only he had been before. It was much deeper in the forest, several miles away. He, who knew the region like no one else, assured us the effort would be worth it. He said the path was long but full of beautiful landscapes for breaks, and that nobody usually ventured that far, especially campers, just looking for alcohol-fueled fun. Tiring, yes, but he promised it would be rewarding. Still buoyed by good humor and the desire to avoid trouble with the other groups, we agreed. Today, I bitterly regret that decision. The hike was long, and gradually fatigue began to accumulate. Our jokes became rare. After hours, our energy was nearly depleted. It was at this moment that something unexpected happened. We saw movement among the trees. We stopped, surprised and a little frightened. Suddenly, we noticed several people in the vegetation. First 2, then 5, 8, until there seemed to be almost 20 of them. They also appeared to be as surprised as we were. I went straight to Nathan, asking where he had taken us, if we were on private property or if there was any danger. He assured me he had never seen anything like this before and tried to reassure me, saying they probably weren't dangerous people. He pointed to an older man in the group, a priest with a serene appearance dressed in black with a clerical collar. We tried to greet them, but received no response. We just moved forward, trying to distance ourselves. Soon we noticed that 2 boys, appearing around 12 or 13 years old, began following us at a distance. Despite trying to be discreet, their footsteps were easy to hear in that quietude. Each of their noises off the trail sounded loud in the oppressive silence of the place. Finally, we reached the spot Nathan had promised, and he was right. The place was stunning, surrounded by tall pines. It was like being in a medieval setting, the kind you only see in movies or books. The proximity of something so magical to the city still troubles me today, especially on nights when I can't sleep. After setting up camp, we prepared something to eat. Hungry and exhausted, we talked, laughed, and relaxed. But soon we noticed something strange. The only sound we could hear was our own voices. The wind that had been blowing gently earlier had ceased. No sign of birds, insects, or any other natural noise. An absolute, disturbing silence took over the place. Night began to fall, and I felt an immense fatigue despite it still being early. Sitting with Rebecca and Lily, we were talking distractedly, while Sarah and Nathan had gone to explore a bit further. It was then that we heard a strange sound, a distant screech, almost like a buzz that seemed to travel through the treetops. Soon after came voices murmuring prayers, and the sound of footsteps running among the pines, rapidly approaching. We stood up instantly, hearts racing, alert to the surrounding vegetation, expecting something or someone to emerge and confront us. We thought about climbing a bit higher up the slope, both to distance ourselves from the obvious glow of the campfire and to try to see better around us. Before we decided, a crash broke the silence, coming from somewhere in the darkness not far from where we were. It sounded like something large had fallen over there. From the opposite side, rapid footsteps cut through the night. But soon we saw that it was Sarah and Nathan running, frightened. They had heard everything too, but despite this, they hadn't seen anyone. They only described the sensation of people running alongside them in the absolute darkness. The feeling that we weren't alone was overwhelming. We needed to decide. Would we return to the truck, even if it meant hours of walking in the dark? Or would we face the night here, surrounded by this mystery? We heard another noise coming from the woods, something heavy that seemed to be dragging itself. Someone suggested that perhaps it was an animal. We gathered what little courage we had left and decided to split up to investigate. Nathan went alone, while Sarah and Lily took a flashlight and went together in one direction. I went with Rebecca in another. We separated only as much as necessary to cover more ground, keeping the beams of our flashlights visible to each other. A short time later, a distant noise came from the direction Nathan had gone. His beam of light was fixed on something we couldn't see. Sarah started calling out, asking if he was okay, but there was no response. The light remained motionless, as if he were paralyzed. We decided to approach. When we got closer, we saw that Sarah and Lily were standing a few feet from Nathan, too afraid to advance. I asked Rebecca to stay with them and continued alone. Each step toward Nathan seemed to last an eternity. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. When I finally got close, I saw what he was illuminating. Before him was a figure that seemed to have stepped out of a nightmare. A woman with elongated arms, twisted like branches. Her body was half human, half tree trunk. She wore something that looked like a cape or black dress, worn like old leather. Her hair was tangled, falling like a wild mass. She dragged herself slowly, as if wounded, avoiding the light but unable to flee. Nathan stood motionless, almost without breathing. With my flashlight, I illuminated her more closely. When the beam reached the face of that thing, she turned her head. Her teeth were pointed like those of an animal, and her skin seemed covered with bark and moss. I felt a strong grip on my arm and almost screamed, but it was Nathan who had regained his senses. He leaned over and whispered in my ear, "It's a witch. They threw her down here from above." Those words chilled me. I had never seen something so disturbing. He pulled me, trying to get us away. But at that same moment, the screech we had heard before echoed through the trees again. Only this time it seemed to come from all directions at once, amplified by countless voices. "They're coming. They're coming to find the other one," Nathan said desperately. Without giving further explanation, he pulled us and we started running. There were 5 of us crossing the trail blindly, while the sound continued to get closer. We tried to stop a few times to understand what was happening, but Nathan was emphatic. "If they catch us, we'll never leave here." And so we ran without looking back, with terror consuming us with each step. Nathan kept repeating that it was a matter of life and death, that we couldn't stop for anything, that if someone fell behind, they would be left because he wouldn't wait. Rebecca and Lily sometimes slowed down, and I stayed behind them, encouraging and pushing them forward. Nathan and Sarah were farther ahead, leading the way. We were descending a slope, and gravity was doing the work, making our run barely controllable. It was then that I noticed something strange among the branches. I noticed figures running in the same direction as us. At first, I thought it was Nathan with Sarah, but I soon saw they were the boys who had been following us earlier. Further ahead, other silhouettes began to appear. I recognized people from the group we had seen hours before. They ran with the same urgency, as if fleeing from something they had provoked. Finally, we spotted a flat part of the trail, indicating we were close to where we had left the truck. The stretch we had descended in an hour had taken several to climb, but something was wrong. The place looked the same, but our truck wasn't there, nor were the other 2 we had seen when we arrived. It was as if everyone had gone away. For a moment, I thought Nathan and Sarah might have abandoned us. He left us, I thought, trying to contain my frustration. Suddenly, an elderly woman appeared, climbing up the trail and waving to us, saying, "This way." This way, with no other option, we followed at a distance, hoping she could show us a safe place to hide. She guided us off the main path, but soon something strange began to happen. Distant screams began to emerge, muffled as if coming from underwater. They sounded like Nathan and Sarah's voices calling for us, echoing from far away. Suddenly, we felt firm hands holding us back. When we looked, it was them. They had appeared out of nowhere, desperate to get us out of there. "What are you doing?" they asked breathlessly. We said we were following the old woman. Nathan and Sarah looked behind, confused. There was no one there, just a deep ravine and impenetrable darkness. "You were walking straight toward it," Sarah exclaimed. Back on the main trail, we went with Nathan and Sarah to where the truck should have been. Now it was finally there. We got in, locked the doors, and tried to process what had just happened. I asked why we weren't leaving immediately, but Sarah explained that the gasoline had been stolen. We could try to push the car downhill, but we wouldn't go far. We found a roll of duct tape inside the vehicle and taped clothes over the windows, trying to block any view in or out. We wanted to completely isolate ourselves from whatever was out there. During the night, we heard voices again and saw through the small spaces we had left figures passing by, running. We recognized some from the earlier group, but tried to ignore them. Eventually, we managed to doze off for a few hours. When the sun rose, it seemed the worst had passed. We decided to split up. Nathan and I would return up the trail to recover our things, while the girls would head down to find gasoline. The day seemed to bring a false sense of security, but nothing could erase what we had experienced that night. After about half an hour climbing the trail, we crossed paths with some men from the group we had met the day before. They were calling someone's name, shouting through the forest as if searching for a missing person. This time we approached to understand. They said they were looking for the priest who had disappeared during the night. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him. We said we were going to our old campsite and would alert them if we found him. It was then that they asked if we had camped at a specific point, describing with precision the place where we had pitched our tents. We confirmed that yes, and they warned us there was nothing left of our camp. They said it looked as if it had been destroyed by an absurd number of animals during the early morning. They added that if anything had survived, it now belonged to the forest, and we shouldn't try to take anything back. We decided to follow their advice and returned to where the truck was. There we found a family with the girls, a woman who appeared to be the mother and 2 sons. They were helping and were shocked to learn we had spent the night there. They had managed to get enough gasoline for us to leave. Before we left, they gave us firm advice. Never return to that region during the night, especially so far from where people normally camp. They explained that although something so strange doesn't always happen, there are moments when the mountains reveal what they hide. What they said next still gives me chills. They stated that even when you don't see them, there are things always nearby, prowling, sensing your smell in the darkness. They feed on you in ways no one can explain. We silently departed from that place, but the rest of the day was surreal, as if nothing had happened. We tried to act normally, as if we weren't carrying that experience with us. However, the next morning, the impact came like a crushing wave. The fear we had repressed until then hit us hard. We became genuinely sick, and now I know that fear in its purest form can make someone ill. Not a day goes by that I don't remember that creature dragging herself, that thing that barely had human features. On rainy nights, it seems I can still hear her lament approaching. I try to believe it's just trauma, but something tells me this will stay with me forever. Strange incidents followed us for months afterward. Rebecca and I would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to find our bedroom door wide open, though we always locked it before sleeping. Sarah claimed she could sometimes see shadows moving in her peripheral vision that vanished when she turned to look directly at them. Nathan became obsessed with researching local folklore and disappeared entirely 6 months later while hiking alone. Searchers found only his backpack. Lily moved across the country to escape the memories, but called me once from her new home in Vermont, terrified because she found a small pile of pine needles arranged in a perfect circle on her bedroom floor every morning for a week. They always appeared no matter how securely she locked her apartment. The local authorities never followed up on our reports. I found out years later that similar stories have circulated about those woods for generations. Native tribes apparently considered that specific area forbidden ground, a place where the veil between worlds grows dangerously thin during certain seasons. The Forest Service has recorded an unusually high number of disappearances in that region compared to other wilderness areas of similar size. I've tried therapy, medication, even hypnosis, anything to convince myself what we experienced was just mass hysteria triggered by exhaustion and fear. But I know what I saw. That twisted figure among the trees was real. The old woman who nearly led us to our deaths was real. The priest who vanished was real. Sometimes I feel like we brought something back with us from those woods. A presence that watches, waiting. On particularly dark nights when the wind falls silent and the world grows unnaturally still, I can almost hear that distant screech again. That sound of something inhuman calling to its own kind. I only hope it's just a ghost of memory and nothing more. Those mountains keep their secrets well. But sometimes, when the conditions are just right, they let their mysteries slip into our world. And once you've seen what lurks beyond the veil of everyday reality, you can never truly unsee it again. My name is Thomas. I'm 78 years old, and though I never imagined I would need to share this story, I feel the time has come to do so. Perhaps it won't be easy to hear, just as it isn't simple for me to tell. This is the story of how I lost everything: my family, my home, and above all, my peace of mind. Maybe by sharing this, I can warn someone else. Or perhaps it's just a record of something no one should ever experience. I was born and raised in a small town outside of Boston, in a modest neighborhood where life was always challenging. From an early age, I learned that to get ahead, I needed to work harder than others, and that's exactly what I did. I started as a helper in a small hardware store, carrying boxes and organizing products. Over time, I saved enough money to open my own store. Gradually, my hard work bore fruit, and I ended up owning several businesses throughout the area. Looking back, I'm amazed at how much I achieved, but none of those accomplishments would have had any value without Eleanor. Eleanor. She was my partner, my strength, the reason everything was worthwhile. We met at a community dance. Always awkward, I hesitated to ask her to dance, but she just smiled and took the initiative. From that moment on, we were inseparable. She was a woman of strong personality, someone who knew how to keep everyone close and united. We married young, full of hopes and plans. We had 3 children, Michael, Rachel, and Daniel, our greatest pride and reason for living. Our home was always filled with laughter. Eleanor was famous among neighbors for her apple pie, and her afternoons in the kitchen were accompanied by jazz music while the children played in the backyard. Despite working hard, I always reserved weekends for outings with them to the nearby lake. Eleanor would welcome me home with that look that said, "As long as we're together, everything will be all right." When our businesses prospered, we got a larger house, simple but perfect for us. In the yard were maple trees, and on the porch, Eleanor loved to drink tea while the sun set. It was there that we celebrated birthdays, school achievements, and faced life's challenges. Being together made everything more bearable. But life so unpredictable can also be cruel. 8 years ago, I lost Eleanor, and everything collapsed after that. It was an ordinary day like any other. She was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she suddenly collapsed. The doctors diagnosed a cerebral aneurysm, something quick, painless. These words, however, brought no relief. They never could. When I returned home, that place that had always been full of life and warmth seemed deserted. In the kitchen, the pot of soup she had prepared was still there. As if at any moment she might walk in and tell me it was ready. But that never happened. I tried to move forward, especially for my children, but it was an enormous effort. Michael, the oldest, immersed himself in work and rarely appeared. Rachel, sensitive as always, tried to be strong, but was often found crying alone in the yard. Daniel, the youngest, seemed completely lost, not knowing how to deal with it all. I wanted to be the family's foundation, but my own pain consumed me. The house ceased to be a home and transformed into a constant reminder of what we had lost. Months passed, but the emptiness remained there unbearable. My children, each dealing with grief in their own way, began to slowly drift apart. Then the unimaginable happened. Eliner's absence not only left an emotional hole, but also undid the bonds that united us as a family. It all started during a lunch I insisted on organizing. The conversation seemed casual until Michael mentioned something unexpected. "Dad, I think we should start organizing the family properties to avoid problems in the future." I was speechless. Organize what problems? I was the owner of the properties, and it made no sense to discuss this now. Before I could react, Rachel tried to change the subject. But Daniel, as if agreeing with Michael, added, "He's right, Dad." Better safe than sorry. That left me bitter. Since when had the children that Alina and I raised with such care begun to see me as a burden or obstacle? Something seemed out of place, but I couldn't understand exactly what. In the following days, the topic of properties gained space in our conversations, and discussions became increasingly frequent. They insisted on the need to put everything in order. I tried to ignore them, believing it was something temporary. But I was wrong. The relationship with them became more difficult. Michael, always direct, spoke of contracts and documents. Rachel tried to lighten the mood, but it was evident that the subject bothered her. Daniel, though quieter, clearly supported his siblings. There came a point when I could no longer bear it. I decided to confront them. I told them in no uncertain terms that the properties were mine, the result of a lifetime of work, and that as long as I was alive, no one would decide anything for me. I thought that would end the discussion, but it only started something even bigger, something I couldn't have foreseen. After that confrontation, I imagined we had resolved the issue. But in the following weeks, I noticed that visits became rarer. When they did come, the atmosphere was charged with discomfort that no one seemed willing to address. At first, I tried to ignore it, but as time passed, it became impossible. Until one day, Michael showed up at the house with a folder of documents. He looked at me with his usual seriousness and said, "Dad, we need to talk." I brought the papers to organize the properties. That phrase filled me with anger that I could barely contain. Papers? Organize? What did it mean? I controlled myself as much as I could, and replied that there was no need, that everything was already in order. But he insisted, "It's for your safety, Dad. We want to make sure everything is clear." The concern he showed seemed superficial, almost rehearsed. I couldn't help but think there was something behind it all. The boy who once ran through the yard full of laughter now seemed like a stranger. The argument was inevitable, and Michael left irritated, leaving the documents on the table. That night, sleep didn't come. I looked at that folder on the table, feeling that something dark was happening. In the following days, the situation only worsened. Rachel and Daniel began to support Michael, insisting that it was the best thing to do to avoid future problems. But in practice, they only deepened the tensions. Conversations that should have been conciliatory ended in arguments. Until one particularly difficult day, Rachel said something that chilled me to the bone. "Dad, we're just thinking about what's best for you. We don't want something to happen and everything be left unresolved." That phrase echoed in my mind. What were my children planning? What did resolve mean? My doubts grew, and the feeling of betrayal suffocated me. It was difficult to accept that those to whom Alina and I had dedicated everything now seemed to act against me. I asked myself if there was still something I could do to avoid the conflict that seemed inevitable. Weeks later, I received a letter that would change my life forever. It was an official notice informing me that I would undergo a medical evaluation to determine my capacity to manage my assets. I was in shock. My own children had initiated this process. A bitter mixture of anger and sadness took hold of me. When I confronted Michael, he responded calmly, but his words sounded like a blow. "Dad, it's for your own good. We want to protect you." The word protect sounded like poison. Protect from what? Or from whom? From themselves. After that, everything happened quickly. A doctor came to my house, a distant man who barely looked me in the eyes while asking banal questions about my routine. I knew it was just a formality, a farce to validate what had already been decided. Days later, another letter arrived, a court decision declaring me incapable of managing my own assets. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. All the hard work of a lifetime was now in the hands of my children. But the greatest pain wasn't losing the properties, but facing the betrayal, knowing that those I loved most had conspired against me. The lawyer who brought the notification tried to soften the situation, saying it was best for me, but I knew the truth. I had lost not only my assets, but also my dignity. The worst was yet to come. Under the pretext of caring for me, my children decided to put me in a nursing home. The place was somber, empty, where time seemed to drag. My room was small, containing only a bed and a table. Through the window, I could see a desolate courtyard with a single dogwood tree, as forgotten as I was. Michael, Rachel, and Daniel didn't visit me anymore. They had gotten what they wanted. I was out of the way. The silence of that place was suffocating. I spent the days sitting, looking out the window, reliving memories of happy times with Alina and my children. However, these memories were more painful than comforting. Until one day, while observing the dry leaves falling from the dogwood tree, someone appeared to break the cycle of loneliness. William, a young employee of the nursing home. William had something different about him. His calm manner and honest smile set him apart from the others. Gradually, he began to sit with me just to listen. He was the first person in a long time who seemed genuinely interested in me. After weeks of conversations, I felt I could trust him, and one afternoon I told him my story. I spoke of Alina, of my children, and how they had taken everything that was mine. William listened attentively, nodding from time to time. When I finished, he surprised me by saying, "My grandmother can help you, sir." I looked at him, confused. Unhurriedly, William explained that his grandmother, Ms. Hayworth was known for practicing unusual things, magic, more precisely. Black magic. At first, the idea seemed absurd to me, but amid desperation, I began to consider it. He noticed my hesitation and added, "You don't need to believe, Mr. Thomas. You just need to be willing to try." That night, William's words wouldn't leave my head. My desperation, coupled with the desire to recover everything I had lost, began to weigh more than any skepticism. A few days later, without thinking too much, I called William to my room and told him that I was willing to talk to his grandmother. Still, I made it clear that I didn't believe in any of it. He just smiled and replied, "You don't need to believe, Mr. Thomas. You just need to want back what's yours." That same afternoon, William arranged the meeting. We went to a simple house on the outskirts of town. It was an old construction, surrounded by dried trees and an environment that seemed charged, as if the air itself had weight. As I crossed the threshold, I felt something strange, a dense atmosphere that I couldn't explain. Ms. Hayworth, a lady with a profound gaze and firm voice, received us as if she already knew exactly why we were there. Without me saying anything, she declared, "It's the anger in your heart that has brought you here." She explained that the work she would do required seriousness, as it involved forces that demanded a price. She said she would need something personal, an object that symbolized my connection with those who had harmed me. Without thinking much, I gave her an old photograph of my family taken in happier times, when Alina and I were alongside Michael, Rachel, and Daniel. With the photograph in hand, Ms. Hayworth began to prepare what she called a ritual of justice. On the floor, she drew a circle with black salt, surrounding it with candles. In the center, she placed the photo and a small notebook that she handed to me, instructing, "Write down the names of those who have hurt you, but do it without hesitation. It requires conviction." My hand trembled as I wrote. When I finished, the names of Michael, Rachel, and Daniel were there. I gave the notebook to her, who examined it in silence before placing it in the center of the circle. Then she lit the candles and began to recite words in a strange, almost guttural language. The air seemed to change as she spoke. A cold wind arose despite all the windows being closed, and the flames of the candles oscillated as if they were alive, following the rhythm of Ms. Hayworth's words. A shiver ran down my spine, and I couldn't tell if it was imagination or something real. After a while, she interrupted the chant and looked at me fixedly. "They accepted," she said. "I didn't ask who they were. Deep down, I knew I didn't want to know. What I wanted was for it to work, for my life to return to what it was before." That night, I returned to the nursing home with mixed feelings: hope, fear, and a disturbing sensation of change. In the days that followed, unexpected things began to happen. It all started with a call from a lawyer recommended by William, a man named Sebastian Gage. He said he had reviewed my case and found serious irregularities in the interdiction process. According to him, my children had falsified documents and manipulated the system to take control of my assets. I could hardly believe it. For months, I had accepted my situation as something final, with no way out. Now, for the first time, there was a chance to recover what was mine. Sebastian explained that there was room to start a process to reverse the interdiction and recover what was mine. When I told William, he smiled calmly and said, "I told you my grandmother knew what she was doing." The legal process was exhausting. Sebastian, an experienced lawyer, conducted everything with precision. During the first hearings, he presented solid evidence that the medical documents used against me were falsified. Michael tried to justify his actions, saying he did everything for my safety, but Sebastian was direct. Safety is not an excuse for manipulation and fraud. My children were visibly uncomfortable. Rachel avoided any eye contact and seemed to want to disappear. Daniel could barely face me. Michael, always haughty, tried to maintain composure, but his nervousness was evident. Each hearing seemed like a battle, but with each passing day, I felt I was closer to recovering my life. However, something profoundly disturbed me. As the case progressed, I began to remember Ms. Hayworth's words about the price I would have to pay. One night, I received a call from Sebastian. His voice was more serious than ever when he announced, "Mr. Thomas, something has happened to Daniel. He was in a car accident. Unfortunately, he didn't survive." It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I couldn't breathe. My heart seemed crushed by pain. I couldn't shake the idea that this could be linked to the ritual. Had Daniel been the price Ms. Hayworth mentioned? Had I traded my son for what they had taken from me? This thought began to consume me. Despite the mourning, Sebastian insisted that we not abandon the process, arguing that we were about to win. A few weeks later, the judge annulled the interdiction, returning to me the control of the properties and the independence that had been taken away. But there was no taste of victory. The void left by Daniel obscured everything. Returning home was a mixed blow of achievement and desolation. I had recovered what was mine, but nothing seemed the same. The house, once full of life, was now an empty and cold space. There were no laughs, no music, no Alina cooking to the sound of the radio. There were only echoes of what once was. On my first night back, I sat on the porch where Alina used to drink her tea at sunset. I looked at the yard, seeking comfort in the trees she so adored, but the crushing silence was the only response. I closed my eyes, and for a brief moment, I could almost hear her voice calling me. When I opened my eyes, the emptiness enveloped me once again. The following days were distant. After the judgment, Michael and Rachel made no effort to contact me, and I didn't seek them out either. Something had broken between us, something that seemed impossible to repair. I wondered if they also missed what had once united us, but there was never an answer. Daniel's death was a weight I couldn't ignore. As much as I tried to accept it had been an accident, the doubt persisted. The pact with Ms. Hayworth never left my mind. Had it been just a coincidence, or was it really the price I had paid? This uncertainty became a burden, something I carried with me at every moment. One day, while examining the papers Sebastian had returned, I came across the photo I had given to Ms. Hayworth during the ritual. Something about that image deeply bothered me. The faces of my children and Alina seemed to have changed, as if time or some mysterious force had altered the photograph. I observed it for several minutes, trying to decipher what caused me so much unease. In the end, I put it away in a drawer, determined to forget the matter. But the discomfort didn't pass. As days went by, strange details began to emerge around the house. They were small things at first, shadows that seemed to move in the corners, or inexplicable sounds during the night. I believed my mind was playing tricks on me, a result of loneliness and stress. However, these episodes became increasingly frequent and difficult to ignore. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard clear footsteps in the hallway. I jumped up, imagining that someone had invaded the house, but upon checking, I found no one. Still, the sensation of not being alone was suffocating, as if something were watching me from the shadows. That same week, I decided to seek out William again. He seemed to be the only person with whom I could share what was happening. When he arrived, he listened attentively as I reported the strange occurrences. Despite his calm demeanor, I noticed concern in his eyes. After a few minutes of reflection, he said, "My grandmother used to say that packs leave marks. Perhaps this is one of them." His words left me disturbed. Had I brought something else into my life by making that pact? William suggested that I see Ms. Hayworth again, but the very idea of confronting her filled me with fear, almost as much as the phenomena I was experiencing. Even so, I knew I couldn't continue like this. I gathered courage and returned to Ms. Hayworth's house. When I arrived, she seemed to be expecting me. "I knew you would return, Thomas. They never leave completely," she said before I could say anything. I reported everything that had happened since the ritual, Daniel's death, the strange events in my house, and the constant sensation of being pursued. Ms. Hayworth listened in silence, and then explained that pacts with forces of this kind always have a cost. Sometimes the payment isn't immediate, but it always comes. They found something to take, and now they're linked to you. Those words brought no consolation, but at least they helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't a product of my imagination. Ms. Hayworth offered to perform another ritual, this time to appease those around you, as she described, but made it clear that this might not resolve everything, as certain things cannot be undone. I returned home that night filled with a sensation of resignation. I knew my life would never be as it was before. Despite having recovered my material possessions, I had lost things far more valuable: my family, my peace, and perhaps my very soul. The following days became an endless cycle of restless nights and silent mornings. At times I thought of Alina and how she would face all this, but now I was alone, facing the consequences of my choices. And as much as I tried to push the thought away, I couldn't ignore the feeling that the worst was yet to come. As days passed, the strange events inside the house became more intense. The shadows were no longer just quick glimpses. Now, I could clearly see them as figures walking through the corridors. At certain moments, a sudden cold would take over the environment, even on the most humid days. The most terrifying, however, were the whispers during the night. In the absolute silence, I would hear voices murmuring my name. I tried to ignore them, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But when objects began to move without explanation, I realized I couldn't continue denying it. One night, as I prepared for bed, the closet door opened slowly right in front of me. A shiver ran through my entire body, and paralyzed with fear, I couldn't approach. I remained motionless, with my heart racing and my eyes fixed. The next morning, I sought out William once more. I couldn't delay it. I reported what was happening, and he listened with a look that mixed apprehension and sorrow. My grandmother always said that pacts leave marks, even after they're fulfilled. These forces don't disappear without consequences, and the marks they leave can attract things beyond our control. I asked what I could do, but William seemed uncertain. I think it's best we speak with my grandmother again. Maybe she knows something more that can be done, but I don't guarantee anything. Despite my reluctance, I knew I had no choice. I couldn't continue living like this. When we arrived at Ms. Hayworth's house, she already seemed to be waiting for us. I knew you would return, Thomas. These forces never leave completely. They always leave something to settle, she said before I even spoke. I explained everything that had occurred since the last visit. She listened in silence, and then stated that the forces I had invoked had found their way to me. It wasn't something that could simply be erased. I can try to close the doors that were opened, but I can't guarantee that everything will disappear. The scars of a pact are permanent. Although it wasn't what I wanted to hear, it was the only way out. The ritual that night was even more frightening than the first. This time, Ms. Hayworth used not only the photograph I had given her, but also a lock of my hair and a garment that had belonged to Alina. She drew a larger and more complex circle on the floor, covered with strange symbols. She lit black and red candles and began to recite words in that incomprehensible language I had heard before. The atmosphere in the room changed rapidly. The air became dense, almost electric. The candles flickered violently, propelled by a wind that seemed to arise from nowhere. Ms. Hayworth continued intoning her words, gradually increasing the volume until suddenly she stopped. A deep and crushing silence took over the space. She finally raised her eyes and said, "They have agreed to stay away for now, but the mark they left on you cannot be removed." I asked what this meant, but she didn't answer, only looked at me with a countenance that mixed compassion and resignation. William took me back home that night, but we didn't exchange a word during the journey. I felt completely exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The following days seemed calmer. The shadows and whispers disappeared, at least for a time. However, even with the apparent normality, the uneasiness didn't leave me. Ms. Hayworth's words wouldn't leave my head. "The mark they left on you will not go away." What did that really mean? What else could happen? A few weeks later, Rachel called me. It was the first time one of my children had contacted me since the judgment. For a moment, I thought she was trying to reconnect, but I soon realized that wasn't the case. Her voice was cold, distant. She called only to say that she intended to sell the house where Alina and I had lived, the place where my children had grown up. "It's best for everyone," she said, with a firmness that cut like a knife. The news devastated me. That house wasn't just a property. It was the last link to the family we once were. I tried to argue, to plead, but it was in vain. Rachel and Michael had already decided. I no longer had a voice in the matter. The absence of Daniel, the only one who had always been on my side, was more painful than ever. With time, I accepted that there was nothing left to connect me to them. My children had moved on, each in their own way, and left me completely alone. The house where I live now feels more like a cell than a home. Although I recovered my material possessions, I lost everything that really mattered. The routine became suffocating. The strange phenomena had ceased, but the loneliness that filled the days was more oppressive than anything I had ever faced. Every corner of the house seemed to carry a memory of the past. I walked through the corridors and remembered the laughter, the happy moments that now seemed so distant they could have been from another life. The nights were even worse. During the day, I tried to keep busy, but when darkness fell, it was impossible to escape the anguish. Alina inhabited my dreams. She was always on the porch with her cup of tea, looking at the garden. But in these dreams, she never spoke to me, just stared at me with an indecipherable smile that brought more uneasiness than comfort. During one of these nights, I woke up startled, with a tight chest and a cold that seemed to have frozen the entire room. I tried to convince myself it was just imagination. But then I heard a sound, not a whisper or a distant noise, but a dry snap coming from the living room. I gathered courage to investigate, but found nothing out of place. Despite this, the sensation that I wasn't alone was undeniable. The next morning, I called William and told him what had happened, hoping for an explanation that would bring some relief. His response, however, only increased my anguish. My grandmother always said that the marks of a pact never completely disappear. Even if everything seems calm, something always remains. Those words haunted me. Did this mean I would never completely rid myself of the consequences of what I had done? Days passed, and the signs began to reappear. This time, they weren't shadows or voices, but sensations that surrounded me. The air seemed heavy, as if something invisible were pressing it. An inexplicable cold emanated from the walls. On some nights, I would wake up with the certainty that someone was standing beside my bed. Whenever I turned on the light, I saw nothing. But it was as if an invisible presence had lodged itself in the house, watching me, waiting patiently. One afternoon, while rummaging through old papers in the study, I came across something that paralyzed me, the photograph I had given to Ms. Hayworth in the first ritual. I couldn't understand how it had returned to my house, but there it was on the table, as if it had been waiting for me all along. At first, I tried to rationalize, thinking it was a strange coincidence. However, looking more closely, I noticed something deeply disturbing. The faces of Alina and my children were different. There was something in their expressions that I didn't recognize, a mixture of sadness and disapproval that caused me discomfort impossible to ignore. That same night, I decided to burn the photo, believing this would end whatever was tormenting me. I watched the flames devour the paper, hoping to feel some relief. However, as it burned, something seemed wrong. The air should have warmed, but instead, an intense cold took over the environment. A shiver ran up my spine, and for an instant, I had the impression of hearing a distant voice, almost a murmur impossible to comprehend. The following days were absolute chaos. I felt on the edge of collapse, unable to distinguish what was real from what was a product of my mind or something beyond. William tried to support me, but even he seemed uneasy with what was happening. Perhaps it's better to leave this house, Mr. Thomas. Some places hold the energies of what happened in them. He was right, but I knew I couldn't leave. That house was all I had left. Even if it had transformed into a hostile place, it was my only connection to everything I had lost. Then one night, something occurred that changed everything. I was sitting on the porch, seeking some relief in the quietude, when I saw a figure in the garden. At first, I thought it was Alina. She looked exactly as I remembered, her favorite dress, the teacup in her hand. But as I approached, I realized something was wrong. Her face changed. Her smile disappeared, giving way to an expression of deep pain. I tried to say something, but before I could, the figure vanished. After that night, silence took over. The whispers, the shadows, the inexplicable phenomena, everything stopped. But the void that remained was even heavier. I knew something had changed, but I couldn't define exactly what. Now, looking back, I realized my actions were guided by desperation. I believed that recovering my properties would bring back something of the life I had lost, but I was wrong. My children remain distant, and the bonds we shared cannot be restored. Daniel, my youngest, is dead, and the doubt that his loss was the price I paid torments me every day. The house where I live is a monument to what once was. Every corner carries memories that weigh like an anchor. Sometimes I catch the scent of the tea Alina used to prepare or hear laughter echoing in the distance. But when I try to grasp these moments, they disappear like smoke. The pact returned to me what I thought was important, but at a cost I could never have foreseen. And although the forces I invoked no longer manifest themselves, I know their presence continues here, silent but constant. I live with the weight of these choices, knowing they affected not only me, but also those I loved most. If there's a lesson I can leave, it's this: don't meddle with what you don't understand. The consequences are always greater than you imagine yourself willing to pay. Today, I know that true wealth was never in material possessions, but in the people we love. Unfortunately, I only understood this when it was already too late. I live in rural Vermont on a property surrounded by dense pine forests, with a long, winding driveway that connects to County Road 37. It was mid-autumn, the leaves painted in vibrant oranges and reds, when everything happened. That afternoon, while clearing fallen branches after a storm had passed through, something strange caught my attention. A figure, someone dressed as a Victorian plague doctor, was walking unhurriedly along the road. They stopped precisely at the beginning of my driveway, positioning themselves in the center, as if measuring each movement with deliberate care. Slowly, they turned their head in my direction, while their body remained facing the road. I have to admit, the costume was unsettling. That long black coat, wide-brimmed hat, and especially the beaked mask that obscured their face entirely. I chuckled nervously, almost instinctively, and tried to offer a friendly wave. Based on stories you hear nowadays, I half expected them to suddenly lunge forward in an attempt to frighten me. But that didn't happen. Instead, they simply turned their masked face back toward the road and continued walking, that long beak profile stark against the autumn sky. I considered calling out something, but deep down preferred not to engage more than necessary. The encounter left me uneasy, but I dismissed it as someone playing an early Halloween prank. Later that evening, as darkness settled over the mountains, I finished my routine of locking the barn and turning off the exterior lights. Once inside, I began preparing dinner while a documentary played quietly in the background. As I chopped vegetables, something captured my attention, a faint scratching sound coming from outside. I opened the kitchen window slightly, trying to hear better, but only the wind and rustling leaves made themselves known. I took a deep breath, closed the window securely, and returned to my cooking. What happened next nearly stopped my heart. Violent, rhythmic knocking echoed against the very window I had just locked. My body froze in a mix of panic and adrenaline. Trembling, with my heart racing wildly, I grabbed the knife from the cutting board and forced myself to look toward the window. However, the darkness outside concealed anything that might have been there. I knew I needed to face my fear. I walked over to the sliding glass door in the kitchen, the one leading to the back porch. With hesitation, I positioned my finger on the light switch, waited several seconds trying to gather courage, and finally flipped it on. What the light revealed was worse than anything my mind could have imagined. The same plague doctor stood motionless outside, now tilting their head to the side like a curious raven, observing me from behind that macabre beaked mask. The leather gloves, the cane they carried, every detail was perfect and perfectly terrifying. My first instinct, well, I thought I should open the door and confront them, maybe even attack first. But it's always easy to decide afterward what should have been done. In that moment, I simply fled, racing up the stairs to the bedroom where my phone was charging, and called the police. While waiting, I heard the knocking growing louder. They were banging on the glass door with both hands, one strike after another, increasingly aggressive. The situation worsened when they began to shout, a horrifying, uncontrolled sound, like someone in profound delirium or speaking in tongues. Words I couldn't understand, but the tone sent shivers through my entire body. I felt trapped. Each minute waiting for the police seemed to drag endlessly, until suddenly, the knocking stopped. From outside, a firm and familiar voice echoed, "What do you think you're doing? Get away from there right now." I peered through the bedroom window and saw Alina, my elderly neighbor, coming toward my house with a shotgun in her hands. The plague doctor had turned to face her, standing perfectly still. Alina didn't hesitate. She fired a warning shot into the air that echoed through the valley. The figure bolted with surprising speed, disappearing into the forest, that long coat flowing behind them like wings in the darkness. By the time I came downstairs to thank Alina, she was already on my porch, shotgun lowered but still ready. "I saw the lights flashing in your windows," she explained. "Knew something wasn't right. Those carnival freaks have been bothering folks all week since that traveling show set up past the old mill." Shortly after, the police arrived, took my description, and conducted a quick search of the area that lasted no more than 15 minutes before they left. They mentioned something about similar reports from other properties along the forest edge. Alina insisted I spend the night at her house for safety. "You don't take chances when it comes to your well-being," she said with the certainty of someone who had lived through enough to know better. Now, as I recount this story, 3 days have passed, and the traveling carnival has moved on. But sometimes, when I look out toward the forest edge at dusk, I can't shake the feeling that someone in a beaked mask is watching, waiting for the right moment to return. What troubles me most isn't the fear I felt that night, but the realization that I never heard the carnival music that should have accompanied such a show. Just the unnatural silence of the forest, broken only by that strange, rhythmic knocking. few weeks ago, a mysterious account appeared on TikTok spreading disturbing messages and unsettling images of people dressed as clowns. Among the posts was a specific threat. They would appear at my college campus during midterms week. Initially, many thought it was just a tasteless prank designed to unnerve already stressed students. But the campus administration decided not to take any chances. Campus security was doubled, and to our surprise, even local police officers were stationed around the grounds to monitor the situation. The time indicated in the posts was around 3 in the afternoon, right when most students would be changing classes or gathering in common areas. When the clock struck 3, the atmosphere across campus became tense, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. My roommate and I still believed it was all just an elaborate hoax. Someone even mentioned they had spotted a clown near the campus, like chasing after a jogger. I just laughed, thinking it was another absurd rumor spreading through our already paranoid campus. Shortly after 3:15, the strained voice of our dean echoed through the emergency notification system. We are initiating lockdown protocols. Secure all doors and windows immediately. Despite the shock, I maintained my composure. We followed the standard procedure. Everyone huddled in the corner of the lecture hall, away from doors and windows. We remained like this in silence for nearly 2 hours when finally, the dean announced that it was safe to return to our dormitories or off-campus housing. I felt an immense relief. I gathered my things and began my walk back to my apartment in the small town adjacent to campus. My place is about 3/4 of a mile from the university center. Normally, a pleasant 15-minute stroll through a scenic wooded path that connects the campus to the residential area. I put my headphones on and started my journey, soon entering the tree-lined pathway that, on that particular day, seemed unusually darker and more foreboding than I remembered. About 7 minutes into my walk, I noticed something odd, a figure wearing vibrant clothes in the distance, partially obscured by the autumn foliage. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after the day's tension. But when I looked again, there it was, a person wearing white pants decorated with yellow polka dots, all torn and filthy. They wore an equally weathered yellow shirt that completed the disturbing ensemble. Their face was covered with a mask, with bright green hair protruding from the sides. The head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and they were just standing there, staring directly at me. Suddenly, they let out a shrill, uncontrolled laugh that echoed through the trees before sprinting toward me with unexpected speed. My instinct kicked in. I dropped my backpack, screamed, and bolted back toward campus, my heart pounding in my ears louder than the music still playing through my forgotten headphones. When I reached the campus security office, breathless and trembling, I reported what had happened. The officer cursed under his breath and immediately radioed for backup. Within minutes, several security personnel and police officers headed toward the area I had indicated. I never found out if they managed to catch the clown, but I desperately want to believe they did. Rumors spread across campus that a clown had made it as far as the main entrance of the administration building, threatening to enter before being spotted by security. I didn't witness any of this myself, but it very well could have been the same individual I encountered. The police organized an extensive search throughout the surrounding woods and neighborhood, but they likely escaped and hid somewhere in the dense forest that borders our small college town. This means that somewhere out there, that clown is still free, potentially spreading fear and causing more terror in our community. The university has since installed additional lighting along the wooded path, and they now offer security escorts for students traveling to off-campus housing. I've never walked that path alone again. I either take the longer route along the main road or make sure I'm with at least 2 other people. Sometimes at night, I still hear that haunting laugh in my dreams, and I wonder if we'll ever know who was behind that mask or why they targeted our campus. What started as what we thought was just an internet prank has fundamentally changed how safe I feel in a place I once considered my second home. I check over my shoulder more often now, and I don't listen to music when walking anywhere. Some lessons you learn the hard way, and I learned that sometimes the monsters from our childhood fears find new ways to haunt us as adults. I needed to share this story because I still can't get it out of my head. I decided to go camping for the first time with Jason, my boyfriend, despite feeling a knot in my stomach. I'd always heard unsettling stories about Blackwood Ridge. Many of these were mentioned in supernatural encounters, podcasts, and forums. Beyond that, my grandfather, when he was young, experienced something so frightening and traumatic in that region that he avoided talking about it. When we would drive from Portland to Seattle, he preferred taking the longer route along Highway 99, bypassing the ridge entirely. And when there was no choice but to cross through Blackwood Ridge, the journey was always hurried and silent. Because of all this, I already carried an apprehension, almost a reverent respect for that place. Still, Jason's enthusiasm was so contagious that I eventually gave in. His family had many happy memories from there and never encountered anything out of the ordinary. We left Portland at dawn, stopped for a leisurely breakfast, and continued our journey. At a certain point, we left the asphalt and took a dirt road, arriving at the wooded area Jason loved so much at the exact moment. The sun began to disappear over the horizon. Despite the forecast of unexpected frost, a rare phenomenon, but not impossible in that area in late autumn, we decided to proceed. We set up our tent and made a fire to prepare a simple meal. The sky, filled with countless stars, was something only Blackwood Ridge could offer. However, the wind began to howl, and the temperature dropped rapidly. Soon, frost began to form, extinguishing our fire and forcing us to take shelter inside the tent. The night progressed after good conversations and laughter. The sounds of nature gradually calmed us, but in the middle of the night, a disconcerting silence took over. It was a silence so dense that it made us realize how isolated we were, or at least that's what we thought. Around midnight, I woke up with my heart racing. A dry sound of branches breaking came from very close by. Jason noticed my nervousness and became alert. The noise not only continued, but got closer, accompanied by a deep, guttural sound, something that seemed to come from a large creature, the size of a horse, walking slowly around the tent. Jason tried to calm me, suggesting it might be some animal disoriented by the frost. Maybe a moose strayed from its group. He had seen some around during nights before. He grabbed a flashlight, made a small tear in the tent, and peered out. What we saw made our blood freeze. A creature was moving around us, large like a horse, but with its body twisted in an unnatural way, as if its limbs were bent at impossible angles. The sound of bones cracking accompanied each movement. The head was the most terrifying part, something between a monkey and a human, but with the skull exposed, skinless from the upper half up, showing only bones. I held back my scream with all my strength. Jason immediately turned off the flashlight. The creature seemed to just sniff around, as if trying to locate us, but without seeing us clearly. It emitted a low growl and continued breaking branches as it walked, coming dangerously close. Each second seemed eternal until, for some reason, it lost interest and moved away. We heard its footsteps growing more distant until everything dissolved back into silence. I have no idea how we held out until dawn, but as soon as the first rays of sunlight appeared, we made the decision to pack everything as quickly as possible and leave that forest behind. While gathering our things, we came across deep footprints marked in the ground, mixed between mud and frost, as well as broken branches all around, confirmation that this wasn't a simple nightmare. The years have passed, but that night on Blackwood Ridge remains vivid in my memory. I never shared this experience with my grandfather. I can't predict how he would react, but I suspect his experience there might be completely different, since the ridge holds secrets that few can explain. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I still hear that sound, bones cracking and branches breaking. And I wonder what ancient, twisted thing calls Blackwood Ridge its home. Jason and I made a pact never to return, but lately, I've been having recurring dreams drawing me back there. In my dreams, the creature speaks to me in a language I almost understand. Last week, I found an old journal of my grandfather's in the attic. The final entry, dated exactly 50 years before our camping trip, was stained and partially torn. The only legible words sent chills down my spine. It remembers. And it waits. Blackwood knows my name now. I've been thinking about visiting my grandfather at his nursing home. Maybe it's time to finally ask what happened to him all those years ago on Blackwood Ridge. Maybe our encounters are connected somehow. Or maybe some secrets are better left buried in the silence of those ancient woods. It was a Tuesday night, well past 2 in the morning, when I was heading back to my apartment after a late study session at the campus library. The walk was short, just under 3/4 of a mile, but long enough for the solitude and silence to make me uneasy. The summer air was thick with humidity, as if the nearby bayou had absorbed all the life and left it suspended in the darkness. I decided to cut through Jackson Memorial Park, a choice that seemed practical but quickly proved to be a mistake. During daylight hours, this park was a popular spot where families picnicked and joggers followed the winding paths between ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. But at night, everything transformed. The trees formed a dense canopy, blocking out the stars, and what little moonlight struggled through the cloud cover. My phone's flashlight cast a beam that seemed pathetically small against the vastness of the darkness surrounding me. Each footstep on the gravel path seemed to echo louder than it should, and I started to regret not taking the longer, well-lit route along Boulevard Avenue. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks, perhaps an echo of my own steps bouncing off the trees. But as I paused to listen, I realized I wasn't alone. There was another rhythm, another presence. Maybe someone else using the park as a shortcut. But something about the cadence of those footfalls seemed wrong. I remembered stories circulating online about strange masked figures appearing in parks after midnight. Stories I had always dismissed as urban legends or internet hoaxes. But standing there in the suffocating darkness, they suddenly seemed entirely plausible. I turned off my flashlight and ducked behind a massive oak tree. My heart was hammering so hard I feared it might be audible, my chest rising and falling in an uncontrolled rhythm. But I forced myself to remain still. For a moment, I considered that fear might be playing tricks on me. Perhaps it was just another student trying to get home, just like me. But then I saw them. Two figures standing motionless, not far away. Even in the weak ambient light, their costumes were unmistakable carnival masks, but not the festive kind. These were grotesque, antique-looking things, with elongated features and cracked porcelain surfaces. Their clothes weren't cheerful, but bizarrely mismatched, as if assembled from pieces of vintage garments that had been buried and recently exhumed. Most disturbing was their complete stillness, like statues planted in the middle of the path. They knew I was there. They must have seen the beam of my flashlight before I turned it off. And now, positioned squarely in the middle of the path, they were deliberately blocking my way. Fear took over, and for several seconds I remained frozen, trying to decide what to do. The air felt heavier, as if the environment itself had turned against me. Then, as if they knew exactly how to unnerve me further, they began to move. The movement was slow, deliberate. Each step they took seemed louder than physics should allow, reverberating through the park like a warning. My urge to scream was overcome by pure survival instinct. As soon as I realized they were coming toward me, I didn't wait any longer. I ran like never before, not looking back. The vegetation seemed alive, branches and vines attempting to hold me back. But I didn't stop. When I finally reached the streetlights of Magnolia Drive, my legs nearly gave out. The relief lasted only a moment. When I glanced back, there was no sign of them, but that didn't comfort me. I sprinted all the way to my apartment building, fumbled with my keys, stumbled inside, locked the deadbolt, drew the blinds, and collapsed onto the floor, trying to catch my breath. A few minutes later, curiosity got the better of me. I needed to check. I went to the window and pulled the blind aside slightly. My heart nearly stopped across the street. Standing perfectly still near the entrance to the park were the two figures, motionless as before, staring directly at my building. At that moment, there was no more doubt. They were following me. But why? The idea that this might be just a cruel prank was tempting. But something about their behavior suggested otherwise. They weren't trying to frighten people for fun. It was something else, something I couldn't comprehend. The night passed slowly. Every small noise seemed like a harbinger of something worse. Finally, exhaustion overcame me, but my rest was interrupted by a sound that froze my blood, a tapping on my bedroom window. It was gentle at first, as if someone was testing for a reaction. Then it grew louder, and more insistent. I couldn't move. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to pretend I was sleeping, but the tapping continued. When I finally gathered the courage to look, I saw a face beneath the small gap between the curtain and the window. A face tilted sideways, watching me. The mask's features were more visible now. Cracked white porcelain, with faded decorative patterns and hollow eyes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The painted lips were curved into an exaggerated smile, as if delighting in my terror. I don't remember exactly how I reacted. I ran to my roommate's bedroom, shouting and crying like a child. He woke immediately, grabbed the baseball bat he kept beside his bed, and went to check. When he raised the blinds, there was no one there. But what he saw was enough to make me feel I wasn't crazy. Handprints on the glass, drawn with what looked like dirt and something darker that glistened in the streetlight. Since that night, the feeling of being watched has never left me. The masked figures haven't appeared again, at least not that I've seen. But something tells me this isn't over. Next time, I'll be ready. I've installed a security camera aimed at my window and motion-activated lights around the entire apartment. But deep down, what terrifies me most is the thought that perhaps they don't need to show themselves for me to know they're there. Sometimes at night, I still hear faint tapping on my window, though when I check, the street below is empty. And occasionally, when walking past the park in broad daylight, I catch glimpses of something white moving between the trees, always just at the edge of my peripheral vision, always gone when I turn to look directly. What's worse, my roommate moved out last week, said he couldn't sleep here anymore. Before he left, he admitted something he'd been keeping from me on the night of the incident. After I'd finally fallen asleep, he looked out the window one more time. The figures were still there, but they weren't looking at our building anymore. They were looking at him. A newly built house, constructed with effort and filled with dreams. A space that should have been the beginning of something beautiful, simple, and full of life. But what happens when something starts to feel different? When the familiar carries an inexplicable discomfort? Have you ever had the feeling that something, no matter how small, isn't where it should be? This is one of those stories. A tale that reveals much more than a home under construction. From the first bricks to the secrets the walls hide. I decided to share this account because it represents a crucial period in my life when everything seemed to conspire against something as simple as our desire to live in peace. My name is Marcus. I'm 35 years old and I lead a simple life. I'm one of those people who endures exhausting work shifts, but still finds reasons to smile alongside family when I get home. I don't have great possessions or luxuries to display, but honestly, that never bothered me. A few years ago, Gerald, my father-in-law, gifted us a plot of land on the outskirts of Willow Creek. It was a gesture I'll never be able to adequately repay. The neighborhood, it's true, was somewhat neglected, with dirt roads that transformed into complete chaos during rainstorms. But for us, that piece of ground was the starting point for something we'd always dreamed of, a home of our own. My wife Sarah and I began building with what little we had. She sold vintage clothing online, items that her relatives from Chicago would send. It wasn't a profitable business, but it always helped with weekly expenses. I worked as a middleman between local farmers and organic produce distributors. It was tough work, full of people trying to take advantage of the person in the middle. But over time, I learned to manage. Every penny we earned was treated like treasure. We didn't do this for ourselves, but for our 3 children, a girl and 2 boys. For many years, we lived with Sarah's parents. I never had reason to complain about them. They were always generous and attentive, both to us and the children. But I dreamed of a space that was ours, a place where I could hang a lamp without asking permission or decide on my own where to hang a picture. Sarah shared this dream. At night, we'd talk about what our house would be like. She wanted large windows to fill the rooms with light, and I wanted a yard where the children could play freely. It was a simple desire, but it was ours. After a full day's work, I would still stop by the lot to help the builders. I'd arrive exhausted, with the smell of soil embedded in my hands and feet heavy from walking. But seeing the foundations of the house being raised renewed my energy. I learned from the builders how to mix cement, carry blocks, and lay bricks. It wasn't my area of expertise, but it made me feel part of the construction, as if each wall raised was a step closer to our dream. At first, we had little contact with the neighbors, just nods or passing smiles. They seemed cordial but reserved, just like us. Sometimes I needed to knock on someone's door to borrow a tool, a hammer, a drill. It was inevitable. Over time, I noticed something strange. People would comment about us in a peculiar way. Not the closest neighbors, but those who lived farther away, those who observed us from a distance. They said we were standoffish, that we didn't socialize, that we thought we were better than them. That confused me. Sarah and I barely had time for ourselves, let alone to socialize. Still, some looks carried a kind of silent expectation, as if waiting for something to go wrong. Sarah and I decided we would only move when the house was completely finished. We made a point of carefully tending to each detail. One of the biggest milestones was completing the wall that surrounded the property. It provided not just privacy, but also security, allowing the children to play in the yard without worry. When we finally moved in, the house stood out in the neighborhood. It didn't seem to clash, but it was different, larger, with wide windows and the wall surrounding it. My father-in-law, seeing it completed, joked that it looked like a house from a gated community. The first months were peaceful. We organized our things, adjusted to the new space, and created a routine. We greeted neighbors when passing them on the street, and some even welcomed us. "Your house turned out beautiful," commented a woman while sweeping in front of hers. Sarah and I thanked her with smiles, but that was it. We weren't close with the neighbors, but we made a point to be polite. Over time, however, small conflicts emerged. The first was with a neighbor who loved playing music at an extremely high volume. The first few times, I tried to ignore it, thinking they were occasional parties. But it soon became clear it was a habit, especially on weekends. The music would start in the afternoon and extend into the early morning hours. Some nights the children could barely sleep, and that deeply irritated me. On one of those nights, close to midnight, I went out to the yard trying to clear my head. The noise was so loud, it seemed to be inside my house. Sarah, always calm, asked me not to intervene. "It's just parties. It's not worth causing trouble," she said. I tried to heed her advice, but it was hard to ignore my frustration. Another episode occurred a few weeks later. I parked my pickup in front of someone's house while organizing some things in our yard. I thought there wouldn't be a problem since it would be something quick, but the man came to knock on our door, clearly bothered. "Can you move your truck? It's in front of my house," he said without even a greeting. The tone wasn't rude, but it wasn't friendly either. "I'm sorry, I didn't think it would bother anyone," I said calmly. But he turned his back and went into his house without another word. I avoided confrontations and knew it wasn't worth insisting on arguments. Sarah, trying to calm me down, would say, "As long as we're good here inside, the rest doesn't matter." Even so, I felt that for some reason we didn't fit in. Sarah dedicated herself to decorating the house, caring for every detail with pieces she made herself. We tried to keep our focus on our family, our home, and the routine we built, leaving everything else second. One ordinary morning, as I was leaving for work, I found the white gate of the house vandalized with spray paint. It was a careless graffiti, without form or purpose, covering much of the front. I stood there staring at those stains, overcome by a mixture of shock and anger. That gate was one of the details that most enchanted us when finishing the house. We chose it because it brought a clean, modern air, and now it was completely ruined. The fresh paint reflected in the sun, and with each look, my annoyance grew. Sarah came up behind me, noticed the state of the gate, and asked who I thought might have done it. I already had my suspicions. A young man who lived a few houses away came to mind. I often heard about him, painting walls of abandoned lots and neglected spaces. He always walked around with a backpack and was accompanied by a group of friends. Although I had no concrete evidence, my instinct pointed to him. I took a deep breath, trying not to act on impulse. I spent the morning trying to clean the gate, but the traces of paint wouldn't completely disappear. I decided I needed something more practical and definitive, so I installed a security camera. I positioned it discreetly, out of sight, but with a clear view of the gate and the entrance to the house. The following weeks passed without incident, and the routine returned to normal. Even so, it was inevitable that from time to time, I would review the recordings, looking for any sign of trouble. For a while, everything seemed calm, until one morning, I found the gate vandalized again. This time, the design was larger, colorful, and much more elaborate, as if the author had all the time in the world to work. Anger consumed me again. I went straight to the camera footage without saying a word. As I imagined, my initial suspicion was confirmed. Although the face wasn't clear, the way of walking, the body, and the backpack were unmistakable. It was the same young man I had suspected from the beginning. I decided it was time to talk to him. I didn't know his name or many details, but I knew his house. That same day after work, I walked over. It was a simple construction with peeling walls and a rusty metal door that seemed abandoned. I knocked twice and waited. The door opened slowly, but it wasn't him who appeared. In his place emerged a woman appearing to be in her early 30s, wearing an apron with her hair tied back. "Good afternoon," I greeted, trying to control my tone. "By any chance, are you the mother of the young man who lives here?" She gave me an indecipherable look, followed by a brief pause, and responded with a dry tone, "I'm not his mother. I'm his girlfriend." I was surprised by the response, but didn't comment on it. I decided to get straight to the point. I found my gate vandalized this morning with spray paint. It's the second time this has happened. I reviewed my security camera footage and clearly saw it was him who did it. I'm not here to cause problems, but I need this to stop. Her gaze hardened and her expression showed growing irritation. You're mistaken, she said, crossing her arms. He wouldn't do something like that. I'm not mistaken, I insisted firmly, but without raising my voice. I saw it in the recordings. I don't want to create a fuss, but it's necessary to talk to him to clear this up. She maintained a rigid posture, looking at me as if drawing an invisible line. Finally, she said he wasn't home, and she didn't know when he'd return. Her voice was sharp, and the weight of discomfort in the air was almost palpable. All right, just tell him I'd like to talk, I responded without directing any more words to her. She closed the door slowly, as if placing a period at the end of a sentence. Later that night, after dinner, I tried to relax. The children were entertained in their room. Sarah was washing dishes, and I was checking some messages on my phone. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasiness that the conversation and the day's events had left. Suddenly, a dry sound interrupted the tranquility of the house. I froze, trying to understand what it was. The noise repeated, louder and more insistent, followed by others, as if stones were being thrown against the gate. I got up immediately, feeling my heart race, and heard the frightened voices of the children coming from the room. Sarah appeared from the kitchen, holding our youngest son in her arms, her eyes filled with concern. "What's going on?" she asked in a tone that mixed fear and confusion. Without answering, I walked to the door, the blows still resonating from outside. Before opening, I took out my phone and accessed the security camera. What I saw made me freeze. It was him, the same young man, now more aggressive, with a stone in his hand and a face full of fury. Without thinking much, I opened the door and took a step outside. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound calm even with the alarm screaming inside me. He stared at me with eyes burning with rage, breathing heavily, as if on the verge of exploding. "Who do you think you are?" he snapped, pointing at me with one hand while holding the stone with the other. "Who do you think you are to accuse me of something I didn't do?" "I'm not accusing without reason," I responded, keeping my distance. "I saw the recordings. I just want to talk and understand what's going on." He exploded in shouts, his voice overflowing with resentment. "Understand what? You came here to humiliate me, to make me look bad just because you have money. You think that house of yours makes you better than us. You think you can step on those who have nothing." I raised my hands, trying to calm him. "That's not true. I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I just want to resolve this without trouble." "Shut up," he shouted, taking a step in my direction. "You and that house of yours are the problem. You came here thinking you can give orders, that you're better than everyone. Why don't you just leave?" His tone of aggression put me on maximum alert. The anger seemed to overflow to the point where he wouldn't listen to anything else. "I don't want to argue. We just need to find a solution," I insisted with a firm but calmer voice. "You shouldn't be here," he shouted again, raising the stone as if to throw it. "That house just gets in the way." I realized there was no more room for dialogue when he stepped forward, and without warning, pushed me forcefully. I didn't fall, but I staggered backward. It was enough to understand that he wasn't willing to talk. Without saying anything else, I turned and went into the house, closing the door behind me. As soon as the door was locked, stones began to hit the gate forcefully. Each impact made the walls vibrate, and the sound echoed through the house like a constant reminder of the tension outside. Inside, the sound of stones was muffled by the children's screams. My youngest son cried uncontrollably, while the other two clung to Sarah, frightened. She did her best to calm them, but her eyes reflected the same desperation I felt. I picked up the phone with trembling hands and called a close friend who worked in the local police department and whom I trusted. I explained what was happening in a few words. He promised he would send a patrol car immediately. The blows to the gate didn't stop. Each sounded more intense, as if wanting to break through the physical and psychological barriers that protected us. Sarah gave me looks of concern while holding the children against her chest, and I felt torn. I wanted to face the situation, but I feared what it might cause my family. Finally, the blue lights of the patrol car illuminated the street. Through the window, I saw two officers approach the young man. He resisted at first, shouting things I couldn't hear, but eventually gave in. They didn't arrest him, but they took him away that night. After that incident, there were unexpected gestures of kindness. Certain neighbors who had kept their distance began to approach. One afternoon, while washing my pickup in front of the house, an elderly couple stopped to chat. "We want you to know you're welcome here," said the woman with a welcoming smile. "That young man has always been trouble for the neighborhood. Don't worry, no one takes him seriously." Other neighbors also began to change their attitude. Greetings became more frequent, although not everyone was receptive. There were still suspicious looks and faces that turned away, but somehow the tension seemed to have diminished a bit. One Saturday, while finishing pruning plants in the yard, I smelled something strange. At first, I thought it might be something in the sewer, maybe a broken pipe. But the odor was different, strong, penetrating, an unpleasant mixture of gasoline and rotten eggs. I began to search for the source. The smell seemed to come from the other side of the wall that faced an alley between vacant lots. I went out through the side door and walked around. The closer I got, the stronger the odor became, to the point where I had to cover my nose and mouth. That's when I saw it, a dead chicken thrown at the base of our wall. Its feathers were covered by a black, viscous substance that looked like paint, but exuded an unbearable smell. I bent down to observe the substance more closely. It seemed to have been deliberately poured over the animal, as if someone had done it with intention. Immediately, the idea of coincidence dissipated. I looked around, searching for any sign of who might have done it. But the alley was deserted, and the nearby houses remained silent. Everything seemed so calm that the contrast with what I had just found was even more disturbing. I returned home without saying anything. I didn't want Sarah or the children to see that scene. There was something deeply wrong, and it left me uneasy. I grabbed a shovel and 2 bags to get rid of the chicken. I dug a small hole in a lot near the alley, but it seemed impossible to escape the smell. With each breath, the stench seemed to stick to me, permeating my clothes and skin as if it were something I couldn't abandon. That night, sleep didn't come. I stayed in the living room, thoughts incessantly repeating the images of that day. And as if that weren't enough, in the same week, something unexpected happened. I was close to closing an important contract with an organic produce distributor, something that had been in the works for weeks. It would have been a great deal with significant profit, something we had been waiting for months. But suddenly, everything fell apart. The distributor canceled the contract without prior notice or a convincing explanation. They just said they had changed plans. The news was a hard blow. We were counting on that money to resolve some pending house issues and advance payments for the children's school. Sarah tried to comfort me, saying I would soon find another client. But something about the way it all happened didn't seem normal to me. Shortly after, another situation arose. Sarah had been tending to some pepper plants in the front garden. She dedicated time and care, watering them daily, ensuring sufficient light, and was proud to see the first fruits beginning to appear. However, suddenly, the leaves began to wilt. At first, we thought it was something simple, perhaps the climate or a passing pest. However, the leaves continued to dry up and fall, and the peppers that were sprouting began to rot, turning black and soft. Sarah was devastated. She had cared for those plants with such zeal and couldn't understand what was happening. We tried various solutions, changed the watering, checked the soil, but nothing worked. In the end, we had to pull out the plants. The empty space left in the garden seemed to reflect the growing feeling inside the house, a mixture of frustration and restlessness. And then there was the house itself, a place we had built with so much effort and dreams, but which in recent weeks seemed to have changed. It was hard to explain, but there was something strange. The environment was heavy, as if the walls carried an invisible tension. Every time I entered after a long day, I felt discomfort in my stomach, an inexplicable knot that had never existed before. One afternoon, while reviewing some papers in the living room, I heard a sharp scream coming from the kitchen. It was childlike and loud, and my first thought was it was my daughter. I got up immediately, heart racing. Upon entering the kitchen, I saw Sarah standing by the stove, our youngest son in her arms, and the other children seated at the table. No one seemed scared. "What happened? Who screamed?" I asked, looking at my daughter. She looked at me with surprise, as if she had no idea what I was talking about. "Scream? I didn't scream, Dad," she answered calmly while chewing a piece of tortilla. My wife gave me a suspicious look, her forehead slightly furrowed. "No one screamed, Marcus. We've been here for a while, and nothing happened." I paused for a moment, studying the expression of everyone around. "I heard it," I insisted with a conviction I hadn't planned to demonstrate. "Someone screamed. I'm certain. And it was right here." Without saying anything else, I returned to the living room, trying to convince myself it was my imagination, but deep down, something told me otherwise. The discomfort that had been growing in me over the past weeks now seemed more present than ever. A few days later, arriving home from work, as I unlocked the gate to park my pickup, I saw a neighbor approach. It was Mr. Jenkins, the oldest man on the street, known for always riding his ancient bicycle. We had exchanged a few words, but never really talked. "Have you heard, Marcus? That young man who vandalized your gate was kicked out of here. Seems they caught him stealing from a small market downtown." The owner saw everything. They said if he shows up around here again, he's going to be in big trouble. I remained silent for a moment, absorbing the information. A sudden relief came over me, knowing that the young man who had caused so much discomfort was no longer around brought a tranquility I hadn't felt for weeks. I thanked him for the news as Mr. Jenkins got on his bicycle and rode down the street. One night when the children were already asleep and my wife had gone to bed, I stayed in the living room reviewing work papers. I tried to concentrate, but the strange climate inside the house seemed to make everything more difficult. It was close to 11 o'clock when I decided to go out to the yard to check on the pickup. I had a habit of verifying that the gate and house door were properly locked before going to bed. But that night, it seemed almost mandatory to confirm twice, as if this could prevent something worse. I took my phone and used the flashlight to illuminate the path to the gate. I pushed it slightly, just to ensure it was well closed. Everything seemed in order. Then I turned to the main door and checked the lock again. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of crickets. It was then that, looking at the pickup parked near the gate, I noticed something on the passenger seat through the windshield. There was a figure sitting there. The silhouette was dark, without defined features, but unmistakably human. It didn't move, as if it were staring at me. For a moment the air vanished from my lungs, and my body was paralyzed, unable to react. Suddenly the shadow moved. It wasn't a brusque or hurried movement. It just slowly bent down, trying to hide behind the dashboard. The dread I felt was suffocating. It wasn't just the sight of something unusual, but the certainty that it knew I was there, looking at it. I took a deep breath and gathered all the courage I had to take a step toward the vehicle. My hand trembled as I held the driver's door handle. It was as if every fiber of my body was begging me to retreat. But with effort, I opened the door and leaned in to see the interior. The passenger seat was empty. There was no one, nothing, just the silence of the night and my racing heart echoing in my chest. I used the phone light to examine every corner of the vehicle's interior, from the floor to the back seats, but found nothing unusual. I remained standing there with the pickup door open, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. I was absolutely certain I had seen someone. There had been someone sitting in the passenger seat, staring fixedly at me. It couldn't be imagination. The days that came after brought a growing unease. My wife began to get sick. At first, we thought it was just a flu or something she had eaten, but the symptoms became increasingly alarming. Nausea would come suddenly, without warning. Several times she would say she was fine, but in a matter of minutes she would start vomiting. It was so sudden that she couldn't even make it to the bathroom in time. She would stay right where she was, with tears in her eyes, apologizing while trying to clean herself up. At first, we tried not to pay much attention. "It must be some food that made me sick," she would say, washing her hands or changing clothes. But as time passed, the episodes increased in frequency and intensity. Sometimes the crises would come while she was cooking or taking care of the children. It seemed that something invisible was attacking her unexpectedly, leaving her fragile and exhausted. One afternoon, as I was finishing tending to the front garden, I heard my son's cry coming from inside the house. I ran to see what had happened, thinking he had fallen or hurt himself, but the scene I found paralyzed me. My wife was sitting in the living room, holding our son in her arms. Her clothes were completely soiled with vomit. The little one cried uncontrollably, with his little hands covered by the liquid she couldn't contain. "I'm sorry," she murmured, crying too. There wasn't time to get to the bathroom. Her face was pale, her hands trembled while trying to calm our son, who continued to cry. I helped her up and took our boy to the kitchen, where I washed his hands and face, while Sarah went to the bathroom to clean herself up. Even while occupied caring for him, my mind couldn't stop revisiting what I had just witnessed. I took my wife to the doctor. Various tests were done, but none indicated anything abnormal. To the doctor, she was completely healthy, and there was no physical explanation for the symptoms. This only increased my concern. If it wasn't something medical, then what was causing it? Sarah seemed equally confused. If there's nothing wrong with me, then why am I going through this? She asked one night as we lay in bed. A few days later, my mother-in-law appeared at our house, carrying a large bag. Since we had moved, she had always been very attentive, concerned about our adaptation to the new neighborhood and the area's climate. But that day, there was something different in her expression. She seemed serious, almost tense. "I brought this for you," she said, removing from the bag a framed image of the Virgin Mary. It was a beautiful piece with an antique, almost sacred air. She looked at us firmly while holding the frame. "I want you to put it in the living room. She will bless the house and protect you." My wife received the frame with delicacy, thanking her for the gesture. My mother-in-law had always had an unwavering faith. Although I didn't share that devotion with the same intensity, I understood the value it had for both her and Sarah. We placed the image in the living room on a shelf facing the sofa, and my mother-in-law lit a small candle she had brought with her. Before leaving, she gave us a serious look and said, "Marcus, you should seek help from someone who understands these things. There are spiritual advisors in the county who know how to cleanse bad energies." I was speechless. Sarah looked quickly at me, seeking my reaction, but I just nodded in agreement, thanking her for her concern. I didn't want to increase her worry, but those words kept resonating in my mind. Although I had never given credit to these beliefs, I began to question my skepticism. At work, it was common to hear colleagues talk about how they consulted psychics or spiritual healers to attract prosperity, close deals, or ward off bad luck. I always viewed this as superstition, a way some found to deal with life's uncertainties. However, given everything we were experiencing at home, the possibility that there might be something real behind it all began to bother me. That night, looking at the Virgin Mary image, now illuminated by the gentle flame of the candle, my mother-in-law's words returned to my mind. Perhaps seeking a spiritual advisor could help. Perhaps there was no risk in trying. But at the same time, something inside me resisted. I feared discovering that what we were facing was really something beyond the natural. In the days that followed, things seemed a bit calmer. But soon, a new discomfort began to emerge in such a subtle way that it took me a while to notice. One night, as I was heading to the children's room to wish them good night, I sensed a strange odor. It was an unpleasant smell, mild but notable, reminiscent of spoiled meat. Upon entering the room, I found the children lying down, almost asleep. I approached my daughter first, kissed her forehead, and adjusted her blanket. I did the same with my sons, but as I leaned over them, the smell became more evident. It seemed to come from them, not from their clothes or the environment, but as if it were impregnated in them. I moved away, intrigued, and inhaled again. The odor was still there, weak but nauseating, as if something were deteriorating near them. I stood there for a moment, watching them sleep. Their breathing was serene, their faces peaceful, but the smell remained. Everything that had happened in recent weeks began to pass through my mind. It was as if each small event was interconnected, suggesting that something invisible was taking over our house, little by little. Perhaps my mother-in-law was right, I thought. Perhaps it was time to seek someone who understood these things, someone who could help us understand, and more importantly, stop whatever it was. Even considering the possibility, something inside me was reluctant. I didn't want to accept that something out of the ordinary could be happening. I didn't want to believe that our home, built with so much effort, was becoming a hostile and strange place. But the reality was that I could no longer ignore it. Something was affecting my family, and the fear that it might worsen made me feel a weight in my chest. It was past 1 a.m. when a dry noise broke the silence, a loud, strong bang, as if stones were being thrown against the gate. Sarah woke up first, sitting up suddenly in bed and shaking me by the shoulder. I got up immediately, heart racing. Another blow sounded more intense, followed by another and yet another, as if someone were unloading their rage on the metal gate. The sound reverberated throughout the house, frightening and deafening. In the next room, the children began to cry. Sarah got up, distressed, to try to calm them, while I desperately searched for my phone to check the security cameras. My hands trembled as I opened the app, and the time the image took to load seemed like an eternity. When it finally appeared, I felt a knot in my throat. There was no one in front of the gate. I brought the phone closer to my face, trying to make sure I wasn't seeing wrong. The transmission showed a completely empty street, illuminated only by the yellowish light of the street lamps. But the blows continued, getting louder, as if something invisible were pounding on the front door. A shiver ran through my body, leaving my skin ice cold. "What's happening?" asked Sarah, holding our youngest son in her arms while the other two clung to her, frightened. Her voice was trembling, and her eyes reflected the same dread I felt. "There's no one out there," I responded, trying to stay calm, although my own voice betrayed my nervousness. She stared at me incredulously. "What do you mean?" "We clearly hear it." I didn't know what to answer. If there was no one outside, then where were the noises coming from? A terrible idea crossed my mind, leaving me even more uneasy. What if the sounds weren't coming from outside, but from inside? I took a deep breath, trying to dismiss the thought, and went to the living room. I looked out the window toward the yard, hoping to find something that would explain what was happening. The plants remained motionless under the cold light of the moon. The wall was intact, and the yard door remained well locked. Nothing seemed out of place. Suddenly, the noises ceased. The silence that settled was so deep that I could hear the irregular sound of my own breathing. I remained motionless by the window, looking at the yard and checking the phone again. I switched cameras to see different angles, looking for any sign, a figure, a movement, even a shadow that could justify the blows. But there was nothing. The street remained deserted, and the gate was perfectly closed. I returned to the bedroom, still trying to digest what had just happened. Sarah was sitting on the bed with the children beside her, hugging her. "Everything's locked," I said, knowing my words wouldn't be enough to reassure her. Nobody got in. That night, we decided it would be safer to all sleep in the same room. We improvised a comfortable space on the floor with mattresses and blankets, so the children could stay close to us. Any sound, whether the creaking of walls or a snap in the ceiling, put my body on alert. Although there were no signs of invasion, the feeling that something was wrong persisted. Exhaustion, however, eventually overcame me, and I fell asleep next to my family. But fear didn't abandon me, not even in dreams. I relived the blows, the gate violently shaking, and a shadow crossing, entering the house while I remained powerless. After that night, we realized we could no longer ignore it. The climate inside the house was unbearable, and the feeling of helplessness in protecting my family against something incomprehensible consumed me. It was then that I remembered my mother-in-law's words about seeking help from a spiritual advisor. Even with all my skepticism, it was the only alternative left. Sarah found a recommended spiritual healer, a woman of about 50 who lived in a quiet part of town. When we arrived at her house, something about her countenance reminded me of my mother-in-law. She received us with a serene smile and welcoming gestures. Her house was simple but full of life, decorated with plants and religious figures. In a corner, a small table caught attention, covered with a white cloth, housing lit candles, a glass of water, and a noticeably worn deck of cards. With a calm voice, she asked us to take her to our house that very afternoon. "I need to feel the energies in the place where everything is happening. Only then can I help." Once at our house, the spiritual healer analyzed every detail with an attentive eye. She sat in the living room in front of the Virgin Mary image that my mother-in-law had given us, and began to arrange the cards on the table in a sequence that seemed loaded with meaning. Sarah and I sat down while she, with firm hands, moved the cards as part of a deeply rooted ritual. The already heavy environment seemed to grow denser with each moment. After a few minutes of silence, she raised her eyes and spoke. "There's a very heavy energy here. This isn't something that arose by chance. It was done to you. It's someone's work, a woman." Her eyes fixed on me as if expecting me to recognize who she was talking about. "It's someone with resentment, someone who doesn't want you to prosper. This energy isn't just in the house, but in you. It was made to weaken and destabilize you as a family, to take away the peace of the home." As she explained, a memory chilled my spine. My mind immediately went back to the woman I had seen at the house of the young man who had vandalized our gate, his girlfriend. The coldness in her face and the suspicious look appeared with disturbing clarity. Everything made sense. The age, the connection to the young man, and the strange attitude that day. My whole body shivered, and the room seemed to suffocate with the weight of the spiritual healer's words. "What can we do?" I asked, feeling the fear growing inside me and transforming into desperation. She asked us to go to the yard while she initiated the ritual. She lit incense and candles, murmuring prayers in a low tone that was difficult to understand. She walked through the house calmly, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. As I watched her, I felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this woman could help us reclaim our lives. It's been almost a year since that night, when we decided to seek the spiritual healer's help. They were months filled with prayers, rituals, and cleansings that initially seemed strange to me, but over time began to transform our house. Gradually, the suffocating sensation that seemed to permeate every corner disappeared, like a heavy veil being slowly lifted. The children, previously restless and sometimes frightened, began to laugh naturally again, running through the yard without fear. My youngest son stopped waking up crying at night, and my daughter began sleeping deeply. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed like a different person. The vomiting episodes ceased a few weeks after the rituals began. She regained her energy, and seeing the sparkle in her eyes again brought a tranquility I didn't even know I needed. The changes also reached my work. Difficulties that previously seemed insurmountable began to disappear. New deals were closed with surprising ease, and opportunities that once seemed distant now emerged naturally. As if something invisible had changed the direction of the wind in our favor. Even with all these improvements, I never managed to completely understand what happened. Throughout the year, I found myself wishing for clear answers, something that would explain why our family was the target of something so heavy. But those answers never came. I presume the woman who harmed us left along with the young man when he was expelled from Willow Creek. We did nothing to provoke them. We just wanted to build our home and live in peace. But for them, that was enough to transform us into targets. This experience showed me something difficult to accept. Some people harbor resentment without apparent reason, no matter how kind or fair you try to be. Some people need just the smallest pretext to spread their anger. And often, that hatred has nothing to do with you, but with something broken inside them. You just become the target of a frustration that isn't yours. Today, looking at our house, I see much more than walls and a roof. It represents what we overcame together as a family. Each detail, each corner carries the memory of what we faced and the strength we found to move forward. The image of the Virgin Mary remains in the same place, on the shelf in the living room, and the candle we light every night is a silent reminder of everything we experienced. I don't know if it was her protection, the work of the spiritual healer, or just our determination that helped us through all this, but I am immensely grateful. And although there are still things I can't understand, I learned something valuable. There is always a path to move forward and protect what we love. The house on Willow Creek stands stronger now, not just in its physical structure, but in what it represents for us. A testament to resilience, family bonds, and the mysterious forces that sometimes test our resolve. The neighbors who once kept their distance now stop by regularly for coffee on Sunday afternoons. The garden Sarah tends is flourishing with vegetables and flowers she never thought would grow there. There's a peace now that I can't quite explain, a harmony that comes from surviving something that tried to break us apart. We don't talk about those days much anymore, except occasionally when one of us catches a strange shadow in the corner of our eye, or when the wind makes a peculiar sound against the windows at night. Sometimes I think I see that woman's face in a crowd downtown, or I imagine the young man watching our house from across the street. But whether these are real sightings or just echoes of a troubled time, I'm no longer afraid. Our home has weathered the storm, and so have we. Last week, as I was fixing the fence in the backyard, Mr. Jenkins pedaled by on his ancient bicycle. He stopped, leaning against our gate. "Your family's done well here after all," he said, with a knowing look in his eyes. "Most folks would have packed up and left after what you all went through." I nodded, running my hand along the white gate that once bore the marks of vandalism, but now stood pristine in the afternoon sun. "Some things are worth fighting for," I replied. He smiled and rode off, the squeaking of his bicycle fading down Willow Creek Road. That night I walked through each room of our house before bed, as has become my custom. The children slept peacefully, no strange odors lingering around them. Sarah was already in bed, reading a novel with a contentment I once feared we'd never reclaim. I paused in the living room, looking at the Virgin Mary illuminated by the soft glow of the candle. Whatever darkness had once tried to claim this space was gone now, banished by something stronger than hatred or envy, or whatever had motivated that woman to target us. As I turned out the light and headed to bed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window glass. Behind me, the empty room stretched quiet and still. No shadows, no figures, no whispers. Just a home finally at peace. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.